History often speaks with thunder, echoing across centuries in tales of blood, glory, and sacrifice. We remember the holy wars for Jerusalem. We recite the legends of Richard the Lionheart, and we tell stories of Saladin with awe. Yet hidden beneath the weight of chronicles and epic poems lies a silence so profound it feels intentional. There was another war, another crusade, that once stirred Europe's kings and papal courts to feverish ambition. It mobilized armies, drained treasuries, and scarred the lands it touched. And yet, it has all but vanished. Few textbooks mention it, fewer sermons ever honored it, and in most official records it is but a shadow, if it exists at all. This was a forgotten crusade, a war history itself seems to have erased. Imagine the world centuries ago, when belief and politics intertwined like strands of rope, binding kings and peasants to a common destiny. Crusades were not simply wars. They were framed as acts of salvation. To die with a cross on one's chest meant eternal redemption. It is precisely for this reason that one crusade's disappearance is so striking. For if it truly happened, and the fractured evidence suggests it did, then why has it been buried so carefully? Why has its memory dissolved while lesser skirmishes remain remembered? The answer is not simple, and it is here that our journey begins. The first whisper of this lost crusade does not come from a grand proclamation, but from the margins of dusty manuscripts. A monk's diary, scribbled hastily between sermons, speaks of a great march of the faithful from which few returned. A letter from a bishop hints at grave shame and sorrow from our misguided brethren in arms. Yet these writings stand alone, orphaned, surrounded by silence. Other chroniclers, who would normally leap to celebrate the shedding of blood for Christendom, write nothing. Their silence is louder than words. Something about this war made them choose erasure over memory. Picture the torchlit halls of medieval Europe, where rumors traveled faster than armies. News of victories or defeats in the East reached even the humblest villages. Men who had never seen Jerusalem could speak of the battles as though they had fought there themselves. And yet, this other war, this crusade that mobilized thousands, faded almost instantly, as if it was swallowed by the earth. This absence gnaws at us. Wars do not simply vanish. They are buried. What could have happened? Perhaps it was a failure so humiliating that the Church itself demanded silence. Perhaps the Crusaders, instead of liberating, committed atrocities too shameful to sanctify. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, this war was never holy at all, but a brutal campaign of politics and greed disguised in religious robes. Whatever the reason, its vanishing feels deliberate. The erasure itself is the first clue, telling us that the truth was dangerous enough to hide. Let us, then, step back into the cold winds of a medieval winter. Imagine knights on horseback, banners of the cross flapping against a bleak gray sky. Their faces are hardened by hunger, their armor dented by travel, their prayers mumbled not with conviction but desperation. These were not the grand parades of men marching toward Jerusalem. This was a grim procession into lands foreign, harsh, and unwelcoming. Snow beneath their boots, smoke rising from villages in the distance, the silence of forests pressing in on them. It was less a pilgrimage than an invasion, less a war of faith than a war of survival. But we cannot begin this story with triumph or honor, for there was none. Instead, we begin with absence, with a puzzle of what was taken from us. In archives across Europe, references to this crusade appear and vanish like ghosts. A papal decree hints at a campaign against enemies of the Church, yet offers no details of its outcome. A royal charter references soldiers who perished in service of the cross beyond the Northern Sea, yet no historian links it to any known war. The evidence is scattered, fragmented, and suspiciously incomplete. And so we are left with questions. Why was this crusade never sung about in ballads? Why were the martyrs not glorified in stained glass? Why, unlike the crusades to the Holy Land, did this one not enter the memory of nations? The answer lies not just in what happened during the battles, but in what those battles revealed about ambition, betrayal, and fragility of truth. To understand the vanished war, we must follow the trail of whispers. We must listen to the voices deliberately muted. And we must be prepared for discomfort, for the story that emerges is not one of holy valor, but of human frailty, of greed, hunger, and choices made in desperation. This is not the story of knights bathed in divine light, but of men trudging through mud and snow, haunted by doubts, driven by debts, and ultimately betrayed by the very leaders who sent them. The vanished crusade was not merely forgotten, it was forced into oblivion. The Church had no interest in immortalizing a shameful disaster. Kings who funded it had no wish to be remembered as fools. Chroniclers, many of them in service to those very powers, knew better than to stain the page with truths that could topple reputations. And so silence spread, heavier than any tombstone. But silence is not invincible. The fragments that remain, scribbles in the margins, local folklore, the ruins of burned villages, are enough to call the ghost of this war back into the light. It demands to be seen, not as legend, but as truth, however uncomfortable. To tell this story is to pierce through the veil of history, to confront the reality that not all wars were holy, and not all crusaders were heroes. The forgotten crusade begins not with glory but with questions, and perhaps that is why it was buried, because questions are dangerous. They reveal the cracks in the grand narrative of divine mission and eternal salvation. They remind us that the past is not just a place of certainty, but of shadows. And so, as we take our first step into this tale, we must ask ourselves, what was so terrible, so shameful, that history itself chose to look away? This is a story of a war that should not have been lost, and yet was. The crusade that dared not speak its name. The war that was erased, until now. The silence of the forgotten crusade is not empty. It is filled with fragments, scattered like broken shards of a shattered mirror. In dusty archives, in the brittle corners of manuscripts that have barely survived the centuries, whispers of this campaign linger. They are faint, sometimes only a phrase, sometimes only a single line that seems almost embarrassed to exist. Yet these fragments, when brought together, begin to form an outline of something immense, something deliberately obscured. Historians who stumble upon these scattered clues often describe the experience as unsettling. Imagine opening a medieval chronicle, hundreds of pages devoted to battles in the Holy Land, the campaigns of kings and knights, and then, suddenly, a gap, a vague line about an expedition ill-fated and misbegotten. No details, no names, just silence, as though the writer was compelled to turn the page quickly, unwilling to stain history with what followed. Why such reluctance? Wars were rarely hidden. If anything, they were glorified. The absence here feels like a warning. The echoes that do survive often come from unexpected places. A monastery ledger records unusual expenditures, vast sums of bread, salted fish, and weapons delivered in haste, with no mention of where they were sent. A papal document mentions indulgences granted to men departing for a northern holy cause, but the parchment is torn, its ink faded. In a letter preserved in a noble family's archive, a widow pleads for compensation after her husband perished in foreign snows under the cross. None of these sources give us the whole picture. Yet together, they whisper of something larger, a ghost of a war waiting to be pieced together. The most haunting of these echoes comes not from Europe, but from the lands the Crusaders invaded. In local folklore, still sung in fragments today, there are songs of men with crosses on their banners who came in winter, burning and plundering, leaving only smoke in their wake. These are not the triumphant tales of liberators. They are stories of devastation, passed from one generation to the next. For those who suffered, the crusade was unforgettable. But for those who waged it, memory became inconvenient, even dangerous. To understand the silence, we must also understand medieval chroniclers themselves. They were not neutral observers. They were servants of patrons, monks loyal to bishops, scribes working under royal command. Their words were tools of politics, not pure history. If a crusade ended in glory, their pages blazed with triumphant hymns. If it ended in humiliation, their pens fell silent. Erasure was not merely an accident, it was policy. And so the forgotten crusade did not fade naturally into obscurity. It was dragged there, hidden behind veils of deliberate omission. Yet the silence is imperfect. Every attempt at erasure leaves cracks. For example, in the archive of a Baltic monastery lies a sermon written decades later, condemning the arrogance of those who carried Christ's name into the snows and returned with nothing but shame. The monk who wrote it never described the battles, but his bitterness reveals something monumental had been lost. Likewise, in the annals of a French abbey, an abbot records a sudden influx of beggars, soldiers who claimed to have fought in the cursed march. He does not explain further, perhaps unwilling to risk the wrath of powerful men. But even in his restraint, the truth bleeds through. Archaeology, too, has added its faint voice. In remote corners of Eastern Europe, excavations reveal traces of fire and destruction dated precisely to the years of this forgotten war. Burned churches, mass graves, shattered weapons buried in the earth. These are not the relics of ordinary raiders. They are scars of a larger, more organized campaign. The earth remembers what the parchments tried to erase. It is this clash between the silence of official history and the persistence of memory that makes the forgotten crusade so fascinating. When kings and popes could not bear the weight of failure, they turned to silence as their shield. But silence cannot hold forever. The echoes in the dust, though faint, betray the truth. They speak of a crusade that never fit the official narrative, one that could not be celebrated, and so it was consigned to oblivion. The question, then, is not whether the crusade happened. It did. The question is why. Why did this war, unlike others, provoke such shame? Why were songs not sung of its martyrs? Why were relics not displayed in churches? Why did the Pope himself turn his eyes away? The fragments suggest the answer lies in the nature of the war itself. This was not a war for Jerusalem, not a war that could be framed as noble pilgrimage. It was something else, something darker, something that did not shoot the grand story of Christ and marching as one against its enemies. And so we are left with these echoes, fragile and incomplete. They do not tell the story outright, but they challenge us to dig deeper, to ask questions that the chroniclers never wanted us to ask. They remind us that history is not just what is written, it is also what is erased. And in the erasure, in the empty spaces between the lines, lies the key to truth. As we leave behind these whispers and move toward the world that created this crusade, one thing becomes clear. This war was doomed from the very beginning. Its conception was not born in holiness but in desperation, greed, and power struggles. Before a single sword was drawn, the seeds of its erasure were already planted. The echoes in the dust invite us to listen closer, to follow their faint trail back to the moment it all began. The papal court, the royal councils, the merchants whispering in the shadows. There, in the heart of medieval Europe, the forgotten crusade was born. The birth of every crusade began not on the battlefield but in the echoing halls of power. Before swords were sharpened and banners were raised, there was a voice of authority, a pope, a bishop, a king, casting words that carried the weight of eternity. The forgotten crusade was no different. It began with speeches, proclamations, and promises. But unlike the soaring rhetoric that sent men marching toward Jerusalem, this call to arms was marked by desperation and calculation. It was not purely a cry of faith. It was a negotiation, a gamble, and perhaps even a deception. Picture the scene, a cold stone chamber lit by flickering candles. The Pope sits enthroned, weary but determined, his advisers whispering anxiously at his side. Christendom is not united but fractured. Rival claimants to the papacy divide loyalties across Europe. Kings bicker, their treasuries drained from endless wars. Merchants watch the collapse of trade routes with hungry eyes, seeing opportunity in the chaos. Into this storm comes the idea of a crusade, not to Jerusalem, not to the holy places sanctified by Christ himself, but to lands few in Rome had ever seen. Lands of forests, rivers, and pagans. Land where the cross could be carried not out of devotion, but out of strategy. The call was framed, as always, in the language of heaven. Preachers thundered in cathedrals that God's enemies lurked on Europe's borders, threatening the faithful. They spoke of heresy, of pagans who defied baptism, of stubborn peoples resisting the light of Christ. Yet behind these holy words lay the true motives, securing political borders, controlling trade, and expanding the influence of both church and crown. Faith was a mask, ambition was a face beneath. Still, the call was powerful. In a world where eternal salvation weighed heavily on every soul, the promise of indulgence, since given in exchange for service, was irresistible. For knights drowning in debt, it meant a chance to wipe the slate clean. For peasants, it was hope of escape from crushing poverty. For younger sons with no inheritance, it was a promise of land and fortune. For kings, it was an opportunity to rid themselves of restless nobles who might otherwise turn rebellion inward. The crusade was not merely a war. It was a pressure valve, releasing the tensions of medieval society. The papal decree spread quickly, carried by friars and heralds across Europe. In marketplaces and parish churches, it was proclaimed with solemn ceremony. Take the cross, and all your sins shall be forgiven. Fight for Christ, and your soul shall be saved. The words were intoxicating. Men wept. Women urged their husband to go. Priests tied cloth crosses to the shoulders of volunteers. Yet in the back of every mind lingered the unspoken truth. This crusade was not Jerusalem. It was not the Holy Sepulchre. It was not the road walked by Christ. It was somewhere colder, stranger, and far less holy. Still, momentum gathered. Nobles pledged their banners. Merchants loaned ships. Monasteries emptied their treasuries. Chroniclers record the enthusiasm of the masses. But between the lines, we see hesitation. Some wrote that this crusade felt without glory. Others noted that certain lords joined not for salvation, but because they were promised rights to conquered lands. The faith that drove men eastward in previous generations now mingled with greed and opportunism. And what of the church itself? For the Pope and his cardinals, the crusade offered more than spiritual conquest. It was a chance to assert authority. Rival popes were challenging Rome's legitimacy. What better way to silence them than by orchestrating a holy war? To raise an army under one banner was to claim divine sanction. And so the papal court wrapped its political maneuvers in the garments of faith, calling upon Christendom to march. The words of the call carried both fire and shadow. One chronicler, writing decades later, recorded a sermon delivered in a French cathedral. Brothers, the enemies of God mock us from the north. They defile the cross. They spit upon his name. Will you sit idle while Christ is wounded again? The congregation, moved to tears, cried out in unison, Deus vult, God wills it. And yet the chronicler added, almost reluctantly, but I saw also the merchants smiling, for they knew they would grow rich. The call to arms was never simple. It stirred both the purest faith and the darkest ambition. In its words was salvation, but also manipulation. Those who answered did so for reasons as varied as humanity itself. Faith, greed, honor, hunger, fear. And this mixture, volatile and unstable, would define the crusade from its first step. The most striking feature of this call was its lack of specificity. When men pledged themselves to fight for Jerusalem, they knew the sacred goal that awaited them. But hey, the banners pointed only vaguely northward, toward lands barely mapped, to enemies scarcely described. It was a crusade into the unknown. For many, that was enough. After all, it was the Pope who promised salvation, and what else mattered? But for others, the uncertainty was ominous. Could one truly fight for Christ in places where Christ had never walked? Could one truly earn paradise by slaughtering those who had never even heard his name? These doubts were not voiced loudly, but they existed. And in that tension between belief and unease, the seeds of disaster were sown. The call to arms was strong enough to gather an army, yet hollow enough that once the army marched, its faith would falter. As the ink dried on papal decrees and the sermons rang through the cathedrals, Europe braced itself for another holy war. Villages watched their young men depart. Mothers wept at church doors. Kings calculated their gains. The crusade was in motion. And yet even in this beginning, there was a sense of unease. Chroniclers later hinted at it, scribbling in margins words like misguided, ill-born, cursive from the start. They may not have known the full story, but they sensed that this crusade, unlike others, would not end in triumph. The call to arms had been given. The cross had been sewn onto shoulders. The banners had been raised. And with them rose not only the hope of salvation, but the shadow of betrayal. For while the people believed they were marching in the name of God, others, those who had orchestrated the call, were already counting their profits, already planning their power. The crusade had been born, but not out of holiness. It had been born out of desperation, politics, and greed. And as the first armies began their march, the question was not whether they would reach victory, but how long it would take before the cracks began to show. The forgotten crusade had begun with words. Soon, those words would be tested by fire and blood. Every crusade carried with it an image, a story that could be told at home by firelight, a vision of night's bath in holy light as they rode to liberate the sacred places of Christendom. The march to Jerusalem was a pilgrimage as much as a war, filled with songs, relics, and prayers. Even the disasters in the East were spun into tales of endurance, the noble struggle of God's chosen warriors. But this crusade was different. From the very beginning, it was stripped of sanctity. It bore the name of the cross, yet it never touched holy soil. It carried the promise of salvation, yet it reeked of politics, revenge, and greed. This was a crusade without glory. The destination itself revealed the problem. Instead of the shimmering deserts of Palestine or the ancient walls of Constantinople, the armies marched toward cold forests, pagan shrines, and villages that barely appeared on European maps. The people they fought were not mighty empires or heretical theologians. They were local tribes, small kingdoms, and communities clinging to their land and faith. 4 knights who had dreamed of Jerusalem. This was a bitter disappointment. The grandeur of holy pilgrimage was replaced by muddy roads, endless snow, and enemies who looked less like warriors of darkness and more like ordinary farmers defending their homes. At first, the papal decrees painted the enemy in monstrous terms. They were called heretics, pagans, idol worshippers, defilers of Christ. Yet when the Crusaders finally encountered them, the contrast was stark. These were not demonic figures. They were men, women, and children, standing against invaders with whatever weapons they could muster. To the Crusaders, this realization was unsettling. To the chroniclers who would later hear their tales, it was shameful. For how could one cloak such a campaign in the garments of holiness? The knights who marched felt the difference immediately. In Jerusalem, a fallen comrade was hailed as a martyr, a soldier of Christ entering paradise. Hey, there was no glory in death. A knight who perished in the snow was not remembered as a saint. He was forgotten, one among hundreds swallowed by the cold. Letters that survive from the campaign speak of despair, not triumph. One soldier wrote bitterly that we fought not for God but for lords who lied, while another confessed to his brother that he feared his soul had gained no salvation from killing those who had never known the gospel. And what of the leaders? In Jerusalem, commanders were immortalized as heroes. Richard the Lionheart, Godfrey of Bouillon, Baldwin of Jerusalem. In this crusade, the names are absent, erased, or deliberately ignored. Kings and nobles who joined soon discovered there was little to gain. The lands promised were barren, the tribute minimal, the victories hollow. Some turned back early, leaving their men behind. Others quarreled over spoils so meager they could not satisfy even the poorest knight. It is telling that no leader of this war ever claimed it proudly afterward. For the rest of their lives, they avoided mention of it, as though ashamed to have ever worn its banner. The chroniclers, too, betrayed their unease. When they described the Crusades to the Holy Land, their pages glowed with divine imagery. Angels guided arrows, relics glistened on the battlefield. Christ himself was said to have walked with the soldiers. But in the few surviving fragments about this forgotten war, the language is stark, almost lifeless. The soldiers are described as hungry, quarrelsome, desperate. Battles are recounted without poetry, sieges with no triumph. One monk even wrote, "The cross was carried, but Christ was not there." For the people who lived through it, the absence of glory was devastating. They had left their homes believing they were embarking on the greatest journey of their lives. Instead, they trudged through freezing landscapes, looting small villages instead of storming majestic cities. They found no relics, no sacred shrines, no holy sepulchres to inspire them. Instead, they found only suffering, starvation, betrayal, and enemies who refused to be villains. The holy war they had been promised felt like nothing more than an armed raid, and perhaps this is why history tried so hard to bury it. For how could the Church, so careful in crafting the narrative of holy war, admit to a crusade that lacked holiness? How could kings, eager to drape themselves in divine favor, accept the stain of such a campaign? Better to forget it entirely than to preserve its shame. Better to write nothing than to admit that Christendom had once sent its armies into a war that brought neither salvation nor honor. Yet even buried, the truth seeps through. Local legends in the invaded land still tell the foreign knights who came with crosses on their shields. But in these stories, the Crusaders are not holy warriors. They are marauders, wielders of fire and steel, whose only glory was destruction. For the victims, the memory was clear. There was no sanctity in this crusade, only suffering. And while Europe may have silenced its shame, the people who endured it kept the memory alive in song and story. This was the heart of the forgotten crusade, its lack of glory. Wars remembered in history are those that can be told as legends. Wars forgotten are those that collapse under the weight of their own futility. And this crusade, born in greed and cloaked in fragile faith, had no legend to sustain it. It offered no martyrs, no saints, no shining victories. It offered only questions, shame, and silence. And yet, even a crusade without glory has a story. It is a story of ordinary men who believed they were marching to heaven but found only mud. It is a story of leaders who promised salvation but delivered betrayal. It is a story of a church willing to gamble with lives of politics. It is a story of how faith can be used, twisted, and discarded when it no longer serves power. As the Crusaders marched deeper into the frozen frontier, the lack of glory became unbearable. They had expected light, but found only shadows. They had sought paradise, but entered a nightmare. And with every step, with every failed siege and empty victory, the Crusade slipped further from memory. For what could be said of it afterward, except that it was better left unsaid? But silence cannot hold forever. And in the ruins, in the forgotten corners of history, the truth still lingers. A crusade without glory is still a crusade. And it is in the absence of glory that its true story, raw, brutal, and unadorned, emerges most powerfully. The march into this bleak war had begun. And though the Crusaders may have longed for songs of triumph, what awaited them was hunger, betrayal, and horrors that chroniclers dared not name. The shadow of futility hung over them, and it would soon turn into despair. The Crusaders had grown accustomed to the grand processions of holy war, banners raised high, priests singing hymns, relics carried before them to remind them of divine favor. But as this expedition pressed forward, the march felt strangely empty. The banners were there, yes, but the air was heavy, not with joy or hope, but with dread. The road ahead was not the well-traveled path to Jerusalem, nor the ancient Roman highways that carried armies east. Instead, it led into the unknown, vast stretches of wilderness, endless forests, and frozen plains where no familiar cities or holy sites waited to greet them. From the very beginning, the land seemed hostile. The road dissolved into mud after even a light rain, slowing the baggage trains until oxen collapsed in exhaustion. Horses that had once thundered across battlefields in the Holy Land struggled to find footing on terrain that seemed designed to break them. The forests were so thick that they blotted out the sun, leaving the army to stumble through shadows, uncertain of where they were or where they were going. Even experienced guides faltered, for the maps that promised clear routes often proved useless. This was a world that refused to be conquered, a land that swallowed armies whole. The further they marched, the more alien the land became. The nights were long, the air sharp with cold, the winds cutting through even the thickest cloaks. For men raised in the warmer fields of France, Italy, or Spain, this climate was unbearable. Fires sputtered in the dampness, and food supplies dwindled faster than expected. Bread turned moldy in the constant wet, wine froze in its barrels, and meat spoiled when supply lines stretched too far. Soldiers who had once feasted on the riches of plunder now gnawed on hard roots and whatever game could be hunted in the woods. Hunger gnawed at their faith as much as it did their bodies. It was not only the landscape that tested them, but also the uncertainty of the enemy. Unlike the Saracens of the East, who fought with organized armies, the people here waged war like shadows. Scouts vanished into the trees, never to return. Arrows whistled from unseen directions, striking down men before they could even raise a shield. Villages, when found, were often empty, burned to the ground by their own inhabitants rather than left for the invaders. This was not war in the glorious sense the knights had imagined. It was a war of ambushes, starvation, and fear, where the enemy could not be seen, and victory never looked like triumph. Yet still the leaders pressed on, insisting that salvation lay just ahead. Priests walked among the weary, preaching that suffering was proof of holiness, that endurance through this wilderness was a greater trial than any battle for Jerusalem. But in the eyes of the soldiers, the sermons rang hollow. For what salvation could be gained in a land where no holy relics lay, where no sacred shrines awaited their prayers? Each step deeper into the forest felt less like a pilgrimage and more like exile. The march broke men in more ways than one. Knights who had once ridden proudly beside their squires now trudged on foot, their horses dead or stolen. Noblemen fought with common soldiers over scraps of food. Brotherhoods that had once sworn oaths of loyalty fractured into rival groups, each looking out only for themselves. Murmurs spread through the ranks, questions about whether God had truly blessed this campaign or whether they had been abandoned. Some whispered that the very land itself was cursed, that the trees and rivers rose against them because the crusade was unholy. Desperation led to cruelty. When food ran short, the Crusaders turned on the villages they could find, plundering not for glory but for survival. Grain was seized, livestock slaughtered, and those who resisted were put to the sword. But even in these moments of violence, there was no sense of triumph. Unlike the capture of Jerusalem, where the bloodshed was cloaked in divine justification, here the killings felt empty. The soldiers knew they were not liberating sacred ground. They were merely stealing from peasants to fill their bellies. The more they marched, the heavier the burden of shame grew. The land itself seemed determined to resist them. Swamps swallowed carts whole, rivers surged without warning, and snowstorms swept down suddenly, blinding and suffocating entire groups of men. Disease followed close behind. Dysentery, fevers, and frostbite claimed lives more quickly than arrows. What began as an army of proud crusaders slowly transformed into a stumbling mass of hollow-eyed survivors, their crosses muddied and torn, their armor rusting from the relentless damp. And yet, turning back was not an option. To retreat was to admit failure, to abandon the vows sworn before God and the Pope. Worse, it was to risk shame at home, where their families and lords expected tales of valor. So they pressed forward, step by miserable step, convinced that somewhere ahead, beyond the forest and snow, there must lie the promised reward. But each day revealed only more wilderness, more silence, more enemies that refused to fight openly. It was in this endless march that the crusade began to unravel. Faith wavered, hope withered, and loyalty frayed. The men who had once dreamed of shining victories under the banner of Christ found themselves trudging through mud, fighting not for salvation but for survival. And though their leaders still clung to the rhetoric of holiness, the soldiers knew the truth. This was no pilgrimage. It was a descent into the unknown, where every mile carried them further from glory and deeper into despair. The march into the unknown was not merely a journey through foreign land. It was a journey into the heart of futility. With every forest crossed and river forded, the Crusaders realized that they were not only lost in geography but in purpose. The path ahead was not leading them to heaven, but dragging them into a wilderness from which neither their faith nor their sword could save them. At last, after weeks of trudging through endless forests and hostile terrain, the Crusaders found what they had been searching for, or at least what they thought they were searching for. Before them rose fortified settlements, wooden strongholds bristling with defenses, guarded by men who refused to bow to the cross. Here, finally, was an enemy they could see, a place where they might prove their courage in open battle rather than perish slowly in the wilderness. Relief swept through the weary ranks. But it was not relief for long. The defenders were not the armies of Islam that the Crusaders had faced in the Holy Land. These were warriors of the northern lands, pagans and Christians alike, bound by loyalty to their homeland and their gods. They knew the land intimately, every hill and marsh, every river crossing that could be turned into a trap. When the Crusaders approached with their siege engines and banners, they were met not with fear but with defiance. Arrows rained down from the wooden walls, flaming torches lit the sky, and war cries echoed through the frozen air. The Crusaders tried to impose the same tactics they had once used at ancient Jerusalem, building towers, ramming gates, and digging trenches. But hey, the weather itself betrayed them. Wood grew too damp to burn properly. Mud swallowed their siege engines before they could be rolled into place. And the defenders were merciless. Under the cover of night, they slipped out from their fortresses, striking suddenly at the besiegers' camps, setting tents ablaze, scattering supplies, and then vanishing back into the forests. The clash of faith and fire was not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts of the men who fought. The Crusaders had been told this was holy war, that their suffering was sanctified, their blood a sacrifice to God. But as they fought villagers who defended their homes with desperation rather than soldiers on a distant holy front, many began to question. Was it holy to burn peasants alive in their churches? Was it righteous to slaughter families because they clung to their old gods or refused to kneel to a foreign king? The sermons of their priests began to sound less like divine truth and more like desperate justifications. Still, violence hardened them. When hunger pressed close and supplies dwindled, the Crusaders unleashed their fury. Entire villages were torched, their inhabitants cut down. Men who had sworn to fight for the Holy Sepulchre now wielded the sword against farmers and fishermen. The chronicles, those few that dared to mention this campaign at all, speak vaguely of purification by fire, a phrase that cloak atrocity in the veil of piety. But behind those words, we can imagine the smoke, the screams, and the terrible silence that followed. The defenders, too, fought with a faith of their own, not the faith of Rome, but the faith of ancestors, of gods tied to the rivers, forests, and skies. To the Crusaders, these people were pagans, idolaters to be crushed. To themselves, they were guardians of a sacred land, fighting not just for survival but for the honor of their gods. Every arrow loosed, every blade swung was an offering, a prayer that their world might not be devoured by the invaders who marched under the cross. What shocked the Crusaders most was the ferocity of resistance. They had expected easy victories, believing themselves chosen and invincible, blessed by heaven. Instead, they found equals, men and women who fought with a zeal as fierce as their own, driven not by promises of salvation in the next world, but by the desperate determination to protect the only world they had ever known. To the Crusaders, this was unsettling, for if their enemies could fight with such courage, what did that say of God's will? The clash left scars on both sides. Battlefields littered with corpses froze under the winter sky, carrion birds circling overhead. Crusader horses, too weak to carry their riders, collapsed on the blood-soaked ground. Entire companies vanished in ambushes, their banners torn and trampled in the mud. For every stronghold taken, two more seemed to rise, as if the land itself produced defenders faster than the Crusaders could destroy them. Victory was never final. Each conquest turned hollow, each triumph fleeting. Among the Crusader leaders, doubts grew, though few dared voice them aloud. Letters written in secret spoke of despair, of men broken not only in body but in spirit. One knight, in a surviving fragment of a letter, wrote bitterly, "We fight not for Christ but for hunger. We burn not for heaven but for warmth." His words captured the despair of an army that realized its holy cause had become nothing more than survival cloaked in the thin veil of faith. Yet even in the darkest moments, pride chained them. To retreat was unthinkable. To admit failure was worse than death. And so they pressed on, convinced that one more fortress, one more victory, might redeem the suffering. But the more they fought, the clearer it became that redemption would not come from fire and steel. The clash of faith and fire was not a single battle but a crucible, a long, grinding struggle where ideals burned away, leaving only ashes. For the people who resisted, it was a defense of their world. For the Crusaders, it was a beginning of a realization that their war was not blessed, not noble, but cursed from the start. In the end, both sides emerged scarred, neither triumphant. Villages lay in ruins, forests were charred, rivers ran red. The Crusaders had won ground, but not glory. Their victories were empty, their faith shaken. And though they marched on, deeper into the hostile land, the seeds of their downfall had already been sown. 4 wars are not only fought with swords, they are fought with meaning. And in this land of endless forests and flames, the Crusaders began to lose the very meaning that had brought them here. Ahead lay greater battles, greater losses, and the slow unraveling of their holy cause. The march into the unknown had led them here, to fire and blood. The path forward would lead only deeper into ruin. The clash with the defenders had left the Crusaders battered but still marching. Their banners, once gleaming symbols of holy resolve, now hung tattered, stained by smoke and blood. Yet the greatest threat to their cause was no longer the enemy hidden in the forests. It was a poison spreading from within their own ranks. Crusades had always carried the seeds of rivalry. Knights and nobles were bound by oaths, but ambition burned brighter than loyalty. Here, in the wilderness, far from the gaze of kings and courts, that ambition began to tear them apart. Supplies were dwindling, men were starving, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some leaders were hoarding food for their own retinues, while others let common soldiers die in hunger. Accusations turned to shouting, shouting to blows, and blows to bloodshed. One of the earliest fractures appeared between the nobles of France and the knights from the German lands. The French accused the Germans of cowardice, claiming they hung back in battle and shirked their vows. The Germans, in turn, sneered that the French were reckless, wasting lives for empty shows of bravado. What began as muttered insults grew into open hostility, and soon camps were divided not by strategy but by nationality. Fires that once burned together now burned apart, and soldiers who should have been brothers in Christ eyed each other with suspicion. Worse still were the rumors of betrayal at the highest levels. Some said certain lords had begun secret negotiations with local rulers, seeking safe passage home in exchange for abandoning the cause. Others whispered of bribes, gold exchanged in the shadows while ordinary men froze in the snow. Whether these rumors were true hardly mattered. The mere suspicion was enough to spread distrust through the ranks. The priests tried to hold the crusade together with sermons, preaching that unity was a divine command, that disobedience to leaders was disobedience to God himself. But their words rang hollow when soldiers saw their commanders feasting on salted meat and wine while the rank and file gnawed on scraps. Faith could not erase the sight of inequality. To many, it seemed God had already abandoned them, and now their leaders were abandoning them too. One chilling story survives in the fragments of a chronicle. A noble knight accused of stealing provisions was dragged before his peers. Instead of being judged with fairness, he was executed on the spot, not by the enemy but by his own comrades. His body, stripped of armor, was left in the mud as a warning. But rather than restoring order, the act unleashed more chaos. Friends of the executed knight swore vengeance, and in the following days, blood was spilled between men who had once sworn to fight side by side. Betrayal did not always come in the form of open violence. Sometimes it was silence, a commander who deliberately failed to send reinforcements, a scout who led a rival company into ambush, a guard who looked the other way while supplies vanished in the night. The wilderness became a breeding ground for treachery, each man forced to wonder whether his companion would still be his ally by sunrise. And yet, amid the chaos, there were those who still clung desperately to the idea of unity. Some knights gathered their men around makeshift chapels, swearing renewed oaths to the cross. Some priests fasted alongside the soldiers to show solidarity. There were even moments of fragile reconciliation, shared meals scraped together from dwindling supplies, quiet prayers spoken in unison. But these sparks of brotherhood were easily snuffed out by hunger, greed, and fear. The betrayal that truly shattered the crusade, however, came not from petty quarrels but from the leaders themselves. When news spread that one of the commanders had quietly abandoned the march, taking his men and supplies back toward safer ground, despair swept the camp like a plague. If those entrusted with guiding the holy war could turn their backs, what did that mean for the rest? The march began to feel less like a crusade and more like a doomed procession, each man walking alone though surrounded by thousands. For the enemy, betrayal within the Crusader camp was the greatest weapon of all. Scouts reported divisions, and local warriors exploited them mercilessly, striking at isolated groups, luring rival factions into traps, and watching as the Crusaders destroyed themselves. Every betrayal weakened the whole, and the defenders needed only to wait as hunger, suspicion, and treachery did their work. The irony was cruel. The Crusaders had come to convert and conquer, believing their unity under the cross made them invincible. But the cross itself became a dividing line. Each group claimed to carry God's true blessing, each leader certain his vision of the crusade was righteous. In the end, their faith did not unite them. It fractured them, sharpening their rivalries into knives pointed inward. By the time the crusade staggered deeper into hostile territory, it was no longer one army but many, clusters of men bound more by necessity than conviction. The dream of a holy brotherhood had withered, replaced by fear of betrayal at every turn. What the enemy could not destroy from without, mistrust was destroying from within. The forgotten crusade was already unraveling, not because its warriors lacked courage, but because they lacked unity. Betrayal within had open wounds that no priest could heal, no relic could sanctify. And as the march continued, those wounds would only deepen, bleeding the crusade of the very strength it needed to survive. Ahead lay battles more brutal, losses more devastating. But even before those trials, the crusade had already been broken from the inside. When betrayal hollowed the heart of the crusade, suspicion turned to something darker, accusations not only of treachery, but of heresy. The Crusaders had set out under the belief that they carried the will of God into uncharted lands. Yet in the long nights of hunger and despair, when prayers went unanswered and the horizon revealed no promised victory, a poisonous thought began to take root. Perhaps they were not God's chosen after all. It began quietly, as whispers in the tents of starving soldiers. Some muttered that their leaders had lied, that this was never a holy mission but a greedy venture disguised as piety. Others, shivering around dying fires, claimed they had seen omens, strange lights in the sky, wolves circling the camp as though sent by pagan gods, sudden storms that tore down their tents as if heaven itself rejected them. To many, these were signs that the crusade had fallen outside the grace of God. And if God had turned his face away, what did that mean for their vows? Priests tried to smother these doubts with sermons, but even their voices began to tremble. They had promised miracles, divine protection, and the glory of salvation. Yet each day only brought more death, more hunger, and more confusion. Some priests doubled down, declaring that doubt itself was heresy, that the sufferings of the crusade were tests sent by God, and that questioning the mission was akin to siding with the devil. But their firebrand words often had the opposite effect. Men already disillusioned began to wonder, if faith only meant endless suffering, was this war truly holy, or was it cursed? Soon, accusations began to fly. Soldiers pointed fingers at one another, claiming their companions had abandoned the true faith. Foreign knights were accused of bringing pagan charms into camp. One man was said to have prayed to the local spirits for guidance through the forests, and though he insisted it was only desperation, he was branded a heretic. Another was accused of mocking the Mass, and though no proof was found, he was beaten nearly to death by his comrades. Fear of hunger was now matched by fear of blasphemy, for to be called heretic was to risk not only death but damnation. Some accounts, fragmentary, uncertain, suggest that rituals emerged in the dark corners of the Crusader camps. Men who no longer trusted the priests sought protection in secret, carving runes into their shields or whispering charms they had once scorned as superstition. Others turned to desperate bargains, vowing to abandon the cause if only they might see home again. In the silence of the forest, where the cries of owls echoed like mocking laughter, it seemed that faith itself was unraveling. The leaders knew this creeping heresy was as dangerous as the enemy beyond the walls. If soldiers ceased to believe, the crusade would collapse entirely. And so, brutal measures were taken. Men accused of heresy were dragged before makeshift tribunals, where sentences were swift and merciless. Some were flogged, others executed, burned or hanged before their comrades as a warning. Yet even these punishments failed to restore unity. Instead, they deepened the dread, for men saw in every execution not the triumph of justice but the desperation of leaders grasping at control. One chilling chronicle fragment mentions an entire company accused of abandoning the faith. Their crime? Refusing to fight when ordered, claiming God had deserted the crusade. They were condemned as heretics and massacred by their fellow crusaders. No details survive, only a line that speaks of the purging of faithless brothers. But the very existence of such a note reveals a depth of fear that the crusade, already torn by betrayal, now threatened to devour itself in the flames of paranoia. For the defenders watching from their fortresses and forests, these divisions were a gift. Rumors of heresy spread quickly, carried by defectors, deserters, and spies. The locals whispered that the God of the Crusaders had abandoned them, that even among themselves they tore each other apart. These stories fueled resistance, strengthening the resolve of those who fought to protect their land. Why fear an army cursed by its own God? The irony was bitter. The Crusaders had come to stamp out heresy, to bring the purity of Christian faith to distant lands. Instead, they found themselves accused of the very thing they sought to destroy. The line between believer and heretic blurred, until no one knew who could be trusted, who was faithful, who was damned. Faith, once the strongest weapon in their arsenal, had become a battlefield of its own. And in that battlefield, something was lost forever. The crusade no longer carried the unified vision of holy war. It became instead a march of frightened men, each wondering whether he still walked in the light of God, or whether he had been cast into darkness without knowing it. Whispers of heresy followed them into every battle, every night spent huddled against the cold. It was not only the enemy who haunted them, but the gnawing fear that their crusade itself was a sin, that they had become the very thing they were meant to destroy. The deeper they marched, the louder those whispers grew, until they were impossible to ignore. And soon, they would not only divide the Crusaders from within, they would echo all the way back to Europe, staining the very memory of the war. The forgotten crusade was becoming more than a failure. It was becoming a scandal, one so dangerous that chroniclers would later blot it out, silencing its memory in the hope that the shame might fade with time. By the time the Crusaders reached the heart of their campaign, the Holy Cross that had once been their proudest emblem no longer shone with its old brilliance. The banners were still raised, stitched with red and gold, but their meaning had shifted. What had once been a symbol of salvation now became a mark of division, suspicion, and despair. The crusade was no longer the march of a united Christendom. It was splintering into fragments, and the cross itself was turning against them. At first, the change seemed subtle. Different factions of crusaders began carrying their banners separately, keeping their own priests, holding their own masses, and refusing to march together. A ritual that had once bound them, kneeling together at dawn to pray before the cross, now fractured into multiple, smaller gatherings. Each group claimed to carry the true blessing of God, while quietly accusing the others of corruption or sin. What had been a single flame of faith was now a scattering of sparks, none strong enough to light the darkness. The turning of the cross was not only symbolic but also practical. Soldiers began to abandon their vows, sneaking away under the cover of night, tearing the crosses from their tunics so they could not be recognized as deserters. To cast away the cross was once unthinkable, a crime that promised eternal damnation. But hunger, fear, and despair drove men to do it anyway. They chose the risk of being branded heretics over the certainty of starvation on the march. By the dozens, by the hundreds, they disappeared into the forest, some never to be seen again. Those who stayed carried the burden of betrayal and silence. For every man who abandoned the cross, others felt their own faith weaken. If even my brother in arms has lost hope, they asked, then how can God's will truly be with us? The cross, once a promise of unity, had become a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. Even the leaders felt its weight. Chroniclers, rare scraps that survive, suggest some commanders grew ashamed of the very symbol they had sworn to save. In one account, a nobleman reportedly ordered his banner lowered after losing yet another battle, declaring bitterly that the cross had become a curse, not a blessing. Though his words are preserved only in fragmentary form, their meaning is clear. The faith that bound the Crusade was collapsing under its own contradictions. The psychological toll was devastating. To march under the cross was supposed to mean protection, divine favor, and the certainty of paradise should one die in battle. But the men saw only graves, hunger, and betrayal. The promise of paradise grew hollow. Some began to wonder aloud whether the entire crusade was a deception, a mask for worldly ambition. Others feared that God had sent them not to triumph but to be punished, their deaths a judgment for sins unspoken. The cross itself, painted, stitched, and carved into shields, began to change meaning in the minds of the crusaders. For some, it became a mark of shame, a visible reminder of their suffering. For others, it was still a desperate lifeline, the only thing keeping them from complete collapse. These two interpretations clashed constantly, and what was once a unifying symbol became a battlefield in its own right. The enemy, ever observant, understood this. Stories spread that locals mocked the cross, calling it a sign of weakness rather than strength. Defenders painted their own symbols on shields, walls, trees, suns, as if to say that gods had not abandoned them, while the foreign god of the Crusaders had turned his back. Each taunt stung, each defeat deepened the fear that perhaps their enemies were right. And then came the worst insult. Captured Crusaders, stripped of their banners, were paraded through villages while their crosses were torn from their tunics and burned in the fire. To see the sacred sign desecrated in such a way was more than humiliation, it was desecration. Yet for the watching soldiers, the spectacle raised an even more terrifying thought. Perhaps the cross truly had lost its power. As morale broke, new rituals emerged. Men began to wear charms, amulets, even pagan trinkets taken from the villages they burned, mixing them with their crosses as if hedging their bets. In desperation, they prayed not only to Christ but to the saints, to relics, to anything that might offer protection. The purity of their holy mission was gone, replaced by a chaotic blend of faith, fear, and superstition. What had once been a crusade was now a wandering, haunted army carrying symbols that no longer carried certainty. The turning of the cross was not a single event but a slow unraveling, a transformation of faith into something twisted and unrecognizable. Each soldier felt it differently, some with anger, some with despair, others with a numb silence that grew heavy with every mile. In this transformation lay the true tragedy of the forgotten crusade. It was not only the loss of battles or the death of men, but the collapse of the very faith that had inspired them to march. To see the cross turn from a symbol of salvation to one of doubt was to watch the Crusade's soul slip away, leaving only an empty husk of banners and broken vows. And yet, the march continued. Despite the despair, despite the betrayals, despite the whispers of heresy, the army pushed forward, deeper into lands that grew colder, darker, and ever more hostile. For some, this persistence was proof of bravery. For others, it was madness. But all of them carried the same haunting truth. The cross they bore was no longer the one they had left home with. It had turned. Ahead lay more battles, more betrayals, and the slow death of the Crusade itself. But hey, in this moment, the turning of the cross marked a point of no return. The Crusade was no longer holy. It was something else entirely, something no chronicle dared to name. When the banners of the Crusade first left Europe, thousands had marched proudly beneath them, singing hymns that echoed across fields and valleys. They had sworn oaths before their families, their priests, and their kings. To desert the Crusade was not just to abandon one's comrades, it was to betray God himself. Yet by the time the campaign dragged deep into its unforgiving path, desertion was no longer unthinkable. It became a daily reality, like hunger or death. It began quietly, with men slipping away at night. Scouts sent to patrol the edges of camps simply never returned. At first, commanders dismissed it as a cost of war. Scouts were killed, stragglers lost, accident happened. But the numbers grew. Soon whole squads vanished. At dawn, empty tents stood like silent accusations, their crosses abandoned in the mud. Every absence left a ripple of fear. If even the faithful were running, then perhaps faith itself could no longer hold them. Desertion was not only an act of survival, it was a symptom of despair. The men had believed in a crusade blessed by heaven, but they found themselves starving in barren landscapes, betrayed by allies, ambushed by enemies, and abandoned by leaders who squabbled endlessly over spoils they had not yet won. Each broken promise, each hollow sermon, eroded the will to stay. If this is God's will, many whispered, then where's his mercy? Some deserters sought to vanish into the countryside, casting away their crosses and disguising themselves as locals. Others tried to return to Europe, a perilous journey across hostile lands. A few even turned mercenary, selling their sword to the very enemies they had once sworn to destroy. Chroniclers, biased as they were, branded them as cowards and traitors. Yet beneath the ink, one senses the truth. Desertion was not driven only by weakness, but by a crushing sense of betrayal. These men had been promised paradise, but what they received was suffering without end. The desertion of common soldiers shook morale, but the betrayal of nobles struck even deeper. Knights and lords who had rallied men with fiery speeches began to disappear as well. Some claimed sudden illness, withdrawing to safer towns. Others quietly negotiated truces with local rulers, trading loyalty for safe passage home. Rumors spread of commanders who deliberately abandoned allies to weaken rivals, choosing ambition over solidarity. Every new betrayal frayed the fabric of the crusade further, until even loyalty itself seemed a dangerous gamble. Yet desertion was not always cowardly. It could be an act of defiance. For some, leaving meant rejecting leaders who had twisted a holy mission into a march of greed. There are scattered accounts of men declaring loudly before leaving, "This is no crusade of God, but a crusade of men." Such defiance was dangerous. If caught, deserters were often mutilated, ears cut off, hands severed, or worse, executed before the whole army as a grim warning. Still, punishments did not stop the exodus. Fear of the crusade itself outweighed fear of death. The growing tide of desertion created a haunting atmosphere in the camps. Soldiers lay awake at night, listening for footsteps, wondering if their tent mate would still be beside them by morning. Trust evaporated. Every conversation carried suspicion. Every oath felt hollow. Leaders preached loyalty, but even they cast wary glances at one another. It was as if the crusade had turned into a ghost army, thinning each day, haunted by the shadows of those who had fled. And desertion was contagious. Each man who left carved a crack in the wall of faith, making it easier for the next to follow. One chronicler, horrified, compared it to plague. They vanished as though seized by an unseen hand, until the camp was like a field of graves. But unlike the plague, this sickness came not from outside, but from within, the decay of belief itself. Those who stayed behind bore the heaviest burden. Every deserter felt like a mirror, reflecting back the doubts they dared not voice. Why remain? They asked themselves, when so many others had chosen to leave. Some stayed out of pride, unwilling to admit defeat. Others clung to fragments of faith, believing that to abandon the cross was to condemn one's soul forever. And some, perhaps the most tragic of all, stayed simply because they had nowhere else to go. In the silence of the dwindling camps, the absence of deserters became almost as loud as the clamor of battle. Empty places of the fire, unclaimed rations, broken shields left behind. They were reminders of the invisible war within the Crusade, a war not against an external enemy, but against despair itself. By the time desertion reached its height, the Crusade was no longer an army in any true sense. It was a fractured mass of survivors, clinging together out of necessity rather than belief. The dream of unity under the cross had vanished, replaced by suspicion, fear, and the gnawing certainty that the holy mission had already failed. And yet, even as men fled, the march continued. A core of soldiers remained, hardened by suffering, bound together by desperation if not by faith. They pressed forward into the unknown, each step heavier than the last, carrying with them the knowledge that they were no longer an army of the faithful. They were an army of deserters who had not yet left. It was here, in this atmosphere of betrayal and collapse, that the forgotten crusade revealed its truest face. Not in glorious battle or holy triumph, but in the silent, steady unraveling of loyalty. For what is a crusade without faith? What is an army without trust? The desertion answered both questions, leaving only a hollow shadow of what had once been called holy. And yet, worse trials lay ahead. For even those who remained would soon discover that betrayal did not only come from those who fled, it came also from those who stayed. If desertion hollowed out the ranks of the crusade, the divisions among its leaders shattered its soul. No crusade had ever marched without tension between commanders. Each came with his own retinue, his own ambitions, his own idea of what God truly demanded. But in the forgotten crusade, these rivalries metastasized into open feuds. What had once been a fragile coalition turned into a nest of serpents, where loyalty was a weapon and betrayal a strategy. The first crack showed in councils of war. Around smoky fires or inside hastily built tents, nobles argued endlessly over routes, over alliances, over who should claim authority. Some believed the crusade should strike directly at the strongest enemy strongholds, seeking swift and decisive glory. Others demanded caution, urging negotiations with local rulers to secure food and safe passage. Still others clung to the vision of capturing relics and holy sites, refusing to acknowledge the starving men outside their tents. Voices rose, fists slammed tables, and more than once, swords were half drawn before cooler heads pulled them back. Underlying these disputes was a struggle not just for strategy but for supremacy. Each commander imagined himself as a true leader of the crusade, chosen either by divine providence or by worldly entitlement. Some held royal blood, others claimed papal backing, and a few simply wielded enough wealth and men to enforce their will. In a coalition built on fragile oaths, no one could afford to be seen as subordinate for long. Pride became the silent enemy of every decision. The soldiers saw this disunity and despaired. While they froze in the night winds and bled in ambushes, their lord debated who should march in front, who should carry the relics, who should take credit for victories yet to be won. Rumors spread through the camp like wildfire. This lord was secretly negotiating with the enemy, that one hoarding supplies, another plotting to abandon the march altogether. The more the leaders clashed, the more the soldiers' faith in them rotted away. Chroniclers, those who survived, wrote bitterly of this fracturing. One compared it to a body tearing itself apart. The head did not command the hand, nor the foot follow the heart. Instead of unity, there was paralysis. Armies stalled for weeks as leaders quarreled, wasting precious time and consuming dwindling supplies. Men died not only from battle but from indecision. In some cases, the Crusades' enemies struck while councils dragged on, exploiting the chaos to devastating effect. But the most poisonous element was betrayal. More than one commander deliberately undermined his rivals, withholding men or supplies to ensure an ally's failure. Whole contingents refused to march, hanging back while others fought, only to sweep in later and claim spoils. One haunting tale describes a desperate battle where a group of crusaders held out for hours awaiting reinforcements, only to be slaughtered to the last man when promised aid never arrived. The reinforcements had been ordered to remain still by their leader, who quietly admitted that he would rather lose men than allow a rival to gain glory. Such treachery corroded the crusade from within. Soldiers began to ask themselves why they should fight at all when their leaders seemed more eager to wound one another than to defeat the enemy. To march under such men felt less like serving God, and more like serving the egos of squabbling lords. Some chroniclers whisper that this was a true reason for the crusade erasure from memory, not the defeats themselves, but the shameful spectacle of leaders betraying their own for ambition. The fractured command also invited corruption. Bribes from local rulers found eager recipients among desperate nobles, who quietly turned a blind eye in exchange for food, gold, or safe passage. A few even switched sides entirely, retreating into the castles of their supposed enemies and leaving their comrades behind. Such acts were rarely punished. How could one condemn betrayal when nearly every leader's hands were stained with it? And yet, amid this darkness, there were flashes of loyalty and courage. Some commanders did their best to hold the line, to keep faith with their men despite the chaos. They tried to rally unity, to remind their peers that the crusade was meant to be greater than personal ambition. But their voices were drowned in the storm. The louder voices, those of pride, greed, and envy, won out. For the common soldier, the fractured command was a daily torment. Orders changed from hour to hour, strategies reversed overnight. One day, they were promised a swift march toward salvation. The next, they were told to turn back, to linger, to wait. Each shift meant more hunger, more exposure, more death. Men joked bitterly that the true enemy was not the sword of the infidel but the tongue of their own lords. And still, the crusade staggered forward. The leaders' rivalries did not destroy it outright. They simply bled it dry. With each passing month, the army shrank not only in numbers but in spirit. What had begun as a holy war now resembled a wandering court of petty kings, dragging behind them a mass of exhausted, disillusioned men. This was perhaps the most tragic element of the forgotten crusade. Battles might be lost, supplies might dwindle, faith might waver, but unity could have saved them. Instead, it was sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The cross no longer bound them, because the men who carried it were more interested in crowns than in salvation. The fractured command was the hinge upon which the crusade turned. After this, there could be no recovery. The desertions would grow worse, the betrayals deeper, the suffering sharper. From here on, every step forward was shadowed not just by enemies waiting in ambush, but by rivals at their side, ready to let them fall. And so, the crusade marched on, not as one army but as many fragments lashed together by circumstance. What awaited them ahead was not glory, no even redemption, but the bitter fruits of division. The crusade was no longer a holy mission. It was a mirror reflecting back the darkest flaws of those who led it. And soon, those flaws would deliver them into catastrophe. Among the many promises that drew men to the forgotten crusade, none shone brighter than the whispers of relics. Not just holy sites or sacred cities, but a particular treasure, an object said to hold miraculous power, capable of securing victory, granting divine favor, and even turning the tide of history itself. It was this relic, more than banners or speeches, that gave many their reason to march. They did not merely fight for the cross. They fought to carry home a fragment of heaven. The identity of this relic remains veiled in mystery. Some chronicles suggest it was a fragment of the true cross, splintered from the wood upon which Christ was crucified. Others claim it was a holy lance, the spear that pierced his side. Still others describe a golden reliquary said to contain the bones of an early saint, venerated for miracles of protection and healing. The truth is blurred, for the records were deliberately erased, and what scraps remain contradict one another. But all agree on this. The crusade carried with it an object so sacred that its loss would be seen as a sign of divine abandonment. At first, the relic was the army's heart. Processions were held before battles, where priests raised it high as soldiers knelt in the date, tears streaming down their faces as they believed God himself walked with them. It gave them courage when rations failed, when allies betrayed them, when nights grew unbearably cold. To gaze upon it was to feel a flicker of light in the darkness. Some soldiers swore they saw it glow faintly, as if heaven's fire rested within. Whether truth or imagination, it was enough to keep men marching when their bodies screamed to stop. But with power came envy. The possession of such a relic was not just spiritual, it was political. Whoever carried it could claim to be God's chosen leader. Rival commanders quarreled over its custody, each insisting that his bloodline, his oath, or his divine right entitled him to guard it. To some, it was less a holy treasure and more a weapon of legitimacy. Control of the relic meant control of the crusade itself. The infighting grew bitter. At times, the relic was paraded as a unifying symbol, raised before the entire army to remind them of their mission. At others, it was hidden away in secret, locked within a chest, guarded by chosen men who swore loyalty not to the crusade but to a single lord. Soldiers whispered rumors that their leaders were using it for selfish ends, conducting private rituals in the night, or bargaining with priests for exclusive blessings. What had once united them now became another source of division. Then came the unthinkable. Amid the chaos of a desperate retreat, when the army was ambushed in a narrow valley, the relic was lost. Some accounts claim it was stolen by the enemy, carried off in triumph to mock the Crusaders. Others say it was dropped in the river as the bearers fled, vanishing forever beneath dark waters. One haunting tale insists it was deliberately destroyed by a commander who would rather see it lost to all than surrendered to a rival. Whatever the truth, the relic disappeared, and with it, the last fragile thread of faith that bound the crusade together. The effect was catastrophic. Soldiers who had endured years of suffering broke down in despair. For them, the relic was not just an object, it was proof that their march was blessed. Without it, the crusade felt cursed, abandoned by God himself. Chroniclers describe weeping men throwing themselves on the ground, refusing to rise, certain that their souls were damned. Priests tried to comfort them, insisting that faith did not depend on relics, but their words rang hollow in the cold air. The relic had been their anchor, and now they drifted into a sea of hopelessness. The loss also deepened the fractures among leaders. Each blamed the others for negligence or treachery. Accusations flew. One lord was said to have hidden the relic for himself, another to have secretly sold it to the enemy, another to have lost it through cowardice. None could prove their innocence, for none truly knew what had happened. Suspicion gnawed at every bond. Soldiers looked to their commanders not as protectors but as thieves. The psychological wound cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. For without the relic, the crusade had no symbol to rally around. The banners still waved, but they were empty cloth, no longer imbued with divine promise. The songs of devotion grew quieter, the prayers more mechanical. Some soldiers, desperate to fill the void, carved makeshift relics from wood or stone, carrying them as talismans. But these were pale shadows of the lost treasure, and they offered little comfort. The enemy, aware of the relic's loss, took every chance to taunt the Crusaders. Rumors spread of mock processions, where locals paraded counterfeit relics to jeer at the invaders. Whether these stories are true or inventions of bitter survivors, they capture the depth of humiliation. To lose a relic was not only a spiritual defeat, it was a public declaration that heaven had turned its face away. And yet, the relic's disappearance did something unexpected. For a small core of crusaders, it stripped away illusions. No longer could they believe in divine guarantees or miraculous victories. If they marched now, it was not for relics or glory, but for survival, for loyalty to the brothers still beside them, for a hope that went beyond the promises of their leaders. This bitter clarity hardened them, even as it broke others. The lost relic became the turning point of the forgotten crusade. After its disappearance, desertions increased, morale crumbled, and divisions widened. Yet in its absence, the truth of the crusade was laid bare. It was never about relics, never about divine certainty, but about flawed men staggering through impossible trials. That truth was too shameful to record, too dangerous to preserve. Perhaps this is why history sought to erase it. Because to remember is to admit that even the holiest of symbols can vanish, leaving only silence in its place. And so the crusade marched on, without its relic, without its certainty, a shadow of what it had been. Ahead lay greater suffering, betrayals yet deeper, and a collapse so profound that it would be buried beneath centuries of silence. Winter fell upon the crusade like a judgment. The snows did not arrive gently, but in waves of ice and storms that scoured the land. What little warmth the soldiers had clung to was stripped away by winds that howled across the barren plains, cutting through armor and rags alike. Fires sputtered in the frozen nights, unable to hold back the chill. Every dawn revealed bodies stiff with frost, their faces turned skyward as if still waiting for a mercy that never came. Supplies had already dwindled, but the winter transformed scarcity into famine. Horses, once proud steeds of knights, were slaughtered for meat, their bones boiled until they dissolved into thin, bitter broth. When the horses were gone, the men turned to dogs, to vermin, to whatever scraps could be scrounged from frozen fields. Some chroniclers whispered darker tales, that hunger drove men to unspeakable acts, that shadows in the campfire light masked crimes no one dared record. Truth or rumor, the fear of it poisoned every glance, every silence. Disease soon followed. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, wounds that would not heal rotted in the cold, and starvation left men too weak to fight off even the smallest sickness. The stench of decay clung to the camp, a miasma that no prayer could drive away. Priests walked among the dying, murmuring absolution over lips that could no longer speak. Yet even their words faltered. How could they preach God's favor when men froze and starved beneath the very banners meant to promise salvation? The soldiers named it the Winter of Ashes, for everywhere they looked, hope seemed burned away. Ash was all that remained in their cook fires, in the empty villages they had stripped bare, in the hearts of men who no longer believed deliverance would come. By night, they whispered that the Crusade was cursed, that the lost relic had doomed them, that God himself had abandoned their march. Fear became their constant companion, and silence hung heavier than any enemy's sword. Leaders fared little better. Some retreated into fortified shelters, hoarding food for themselves and their households while soldiers starved outside. Others tried to inspire endurance, but their words rang hollow against the howling winds. Rivalries did not vanish with the cold. They sharpened. Lords accused one another of wasting supplies, of refusing aid, of abandoning their duties. Men began to mutter that they were less the servants of Christ and more the pawns of squabbling nobles. The fractures of command became chasms, widening with every frozen night. Yet amid this despair, strange rituals emerged. Soldiers began carrying ashes in small pouches, believing that a pinch scattered over their food would ward off hunger. Others smeared ash across their faces, hoping it would protect them from disease. Priests condemned such practices as superstition, but their condemnations lacked force. After all, what had prayers achieved? In the silence of the snow, faith warped into desperation, and desperation birthed its own kind of faith. The winter also brought eerie encounters. Locals, hardened by generations of harsh seasons, sometimes approached the Crusaders, not with weapons, but with contempt. They offered scraps of food at impossible prices, or demanded relics and weapons in exchange for grain. Some disappeared into the night after luring Crusaders into ambushes. Others simply laughed at their suffering, mocking the so-called holy warriors who could barely stand. For the invaders, every meeting with the people of the land was another reminder of their weakness, another wound to their pride. It was in this season that the Crusade songs died. Once, hymns had rolled through the camps at dusk, voices lifting into the dark as if to call down heaven itself. But now, silence ruled. No songs, no prayers, only the sound of coughing, the creak of frozen leather, the shuffle of boots over ice. The absence of music was its own kind of death, as though even the memory of joy had been extinguished. The Winter of Ashes became the crucible that revealed the true nature of the Crusade. Some men clung stubbornly to faith, whispering prayers even as their bodies failed. Others hardened into survivalists, caring nothing for God or honor, only for another mouthful of food, another day alive. Many gave up entirely, lying down in the snow and refusing to rise, surrendering to the white silence. The crusade that had once been a march of faith was now a march of ghosts, stumbling forward without purpose except to escape the cold. For those who survived, the scars lasted forever. The memory of the winter burned itself into their souls, darker than any battlefield, heavier than any defeat. To endure it was to carry ashes inside, a reminder that faith could falter, leaders could betray, and God could remain silent. That memory explains why this crusade was buried in silence. For how could Christendom celebrate an army that froze in the snow, reduced to ashes and despair? And yet, the crusade did not end there. Against all reason, against all mercy, a corps of survivors pressed onward when the snows finally relented. They emerged from the winter gaunt, hollow-eyed, their numbers halved, their faith fractured, but still alive. What kept them moving was no longer clear. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps it was pride, perhaps the faintest flicker of belief that something awaited them beyond the suffering. But the winter had changed them. They no longer marched as an army of God, but as a band of survivors who had walked through death and carried its ashes on their skin. Ahead, new trials waited, and with them betrayals yet darker than frost. The crusade had not died in the winter of ashes, but it had been transformed. What emerged from the snow was no holy army, but something colder, harder, and far more desperate. When the winter finally released its grip, the crusade stumbled forward not with triumph, but with suspicion burning hotter than any fire. The leaders gathered to count their survivors, but what should have been a moment of unity became a stage for blame. Each lord accused another for the hunger, for the cold, for the endless graves that lined their path. Voices rose in bitter fury until swords nearly leapt from their scabbards. The Crusade, meant to be one army under God, had become a nest of serpents, each hissing and coiling for advantage. The common soldiers saw the divisions and despaired. Men who had marched behind banners of the cross now muttered that those banners meant nothing, that their lords cared only for pride and plunder. A knight who had lost half his household to frostbite spat openly at a commander's feet, daring him to strike. Discipline unraveled like rotten cloth, and whispers filled the camp. Why follow men who cannot even feed us? Some deserted into the forests, seeking refuge among villages, while others drifted into rival camps, swearing fealty to whichever lord promised survival. Loyalty had become a currency, cheap and easily traded. The commanders themselves hardened their factions. Food was hoarded behind guarded tents. Weapons and armor, once shared for the cause, were locked away for private armies. Secret councils were held at night, where plots were whispered and alliances brokered like deals at a marketplace. The Crusade was still one host in name, but in truth it had splintered into rival courts, each circling the others with predators' patience. What had begun as a holy war was now a chessboard of ambition. Into this tension crept paranoia. Rumors spread like wildfire, that one lord had bargained with local chieftains to betray the Crusade, that another had abandoned villages full of supplies to starve rivals, that secret letters were carried under the cloak of night. Whenever food went missing, fingers pointed. Whenever scouts failed to return, suspicions deepened. Trust became impossible. Even allies watched each other with narrowed eyes, wondering when friendship would give way to treachery. Among the ranks, fear turned to violence. Small skirmishes broke out within the camp itself, men of one banner clashing with men of another over a crust of bread, a patch of firewood, or a simple insult. Once, these fights had been quelled by commanders, but now those very commanders encouraged them in secret, testing the strength of rivals, bleeding them without open war. Bodies began to appear not only from hunger or disease, but from daggers thrust in the dark. The priests who had once been the voice of unity now found themselves powerless. They preached peace, forgiveness, and obedience, but their words were drowned in the roar of factional pride. Some priests even abandoned their vows, aligning themselves with lords who promised wealth or protection. Those who resisted too strongly vanished, swallowed by the night. Religion, once the rallying cry of the Crusade, had become another tool of politics, a mask worn by men whose eyes glimmered only with greed. For the ordinary crusader, the fractures of command were worse than the winter. At least the snow had been an enemy they could see, a cruelty of nature that spared no man. But betrayal was a colder storm, one that came not from the sky but from the very leaders sworn to protect them. Soldiers no longer knew whose orders to obey, whose promises to trust, whose banner to follow. Each dawn brought the fear that today the Crusade would finally turn its swords inward. Yet, strangely, the march continued. Despite the hatred, despite the feuds, the splintered host pressed deeper into foreign lands. Each faction believed itself destined to seize glory, to outmaneuver rivals, to claim the prize that had lured them across the world. The very divisions that threatened to destroy the Crusade also fueled it forward, as each lord feared falling behind the others. Pride and rivalry became a whip, lashing them onward even as unity crumbled. For the chroniclers, the fractured command became the most dangerous silence of all. How could they write of holy unity when the Crusade teetered on civil war? How could they describe betrayal without condemning nobles whose names still held power in Europe? So they wrote cautiously, recording battles against enemies, omitting the blood spilled between supposed brothers. But the soldiers who survived carried the truth in their memories, the whispered bargains, the hoarded food, the blade in the dark. It was in this season of division that the seeds of later disaster were planted. Every betrayal left scars that would be opened again when famine returned. Every secret pact laid the ground for future treachery. The Crusade marched, yes, but it marched on a fault line, and each step deepened the cracks. The fractured command ensured that the Crusade would never again be one body. From this point onward, every decision, every battle, every hardship was twisted by suspicion and rivalry. Even when they fought side by side, the lords fought also against one another, measuring victories not in God's glory but in the ruin of their rivals. The crusade that had set out as a single flame of faith was now many small fires, each threatening to consume the other. And while the men still carried crosses on their shields, those crosses no longer marked them as brothers, but as pawns caught in a struggle where betrayal had become inevitable. It was not the winter that doomed the crusade, nor hunger, nor disease. It was a shattering of trust. For without unity, even the greatest host becomes nothing more than fragments, destined to scatter like ashes in the wind. The further the crusade marched, the more its path was haunted not only by enemies beyond its walls, but by whispers from within. Treachery was no longer a spectre in the minds of a few. It became the unspoken language of survival. Every campfire flickered with rumors. Every shadow seemed to conceal a spy. To live was not only to fight the external foe, but to suspect one's own brother in arms. Stories circulated like poison. A column of scouts vanishing without a trace was said to have been sold to local tribes by one of the lords. A supply caravan, supposedly lost to the wilderness, was suspected of being redirected into secret caches guarded by rival banners. A priest was accused of carrying coded letters sewn into his robe, meant for foreign kings who waited to strike the crusade when it was weakest. No proof ever surfaced, yet every rumor carried the weight of truth, because trust had already collapsed. Among the soldiers, paranoia grew unbearable. Men refused to sleep deeply, clutching their daggers beneath their cloaks, eyes darting at the sound of every footstep in the night. Comrades who once shared bread now eyed each other as if the next mouthful might be poisoned. Some squads would only eat food prepared in front of them. Others drank only from wells they themselves had dug. Fear reshaped daily life more thoroughly than hunger. The leaders fared no better. Suspicion spread into their councils, poisoning every decision. If one lord proposed an attack, another countered that it must be a trap to weaken his army. If reinforcements arrived, their loyalty was questioned. Were they allies or pawns in some deeper game? Even victories on the battlefield became suspect, for some whispered that enemies had been paid to retreat, giving false glory to certain commanders. Nothing was believed at face value. Every deed was seen through the lens of betrayal. What made the treachery so suffocating was that some of it was true. Hidden deals were struck, promises exchanged in candlelit tents. Certain lords secretly spared enemy villages in exchange for supplies or guides. Some even sent word back to Europe, seeking personal pardon or favor, ready to abandon the crusade altogether if their fortunes turned too grim. Treachery was not a mere rumor. It was real, but so cleverly woven into lies that no one could tell where fact ended and paranoia began. The most terrifying betrayal was not of men, but of faith. Some crusaders, despairing of divine favor, began to barter with local beliefs, wearing charms and invoking spirits they had once denounced as heathen. Others mocked the priests openly, saying God had abandoned them. A few lords, desperate to preserve their own power, considered alliances with the very enemies they had sworn to conquer. In such choices, the original purpose of the crusade dissolved, leaving only the raw instinct to survive at any cost. Yet, betrayal also became a weapon. Leaders whispered lies deliberately, spreading rumors about rivals to weaken them. A failed hunt might be blamed on sabotage. A skirmish loss could be painted as evidence of treachery, even if it was only misfortune. The camp was a chessboard of deception, and every rumor pushed the pieces further toward chaos. For ordinary soldiers, trapped in the middle, the weight of suspicion became unbearable. Some deserted in silence, choosing the uncertainty of exile over the certainty of betrayal. Treachery was no longer hidden in the shadows. It shaped the very structure of the crusade. Guards were doubled, but not to protect against outside raids. They stood watch over their own allies. Weapons were kept at hand not only for battle, but for sudden betrayal in camp. When councils met, men entered armed, their hands resting on hilts as if diplomacy itself were a duel waiting to begin. The shadow of treachery made every small hardship heavier. Hunger became an accusation. Sickness became a conspiracy. Even the weather seemed suspect. If storms scattered the crusaders' supplies, some swore it was because an enemy lord had bargained with dark forces. Logic no longer mattered. Fear explained everything. The crusade had become like a body infected with fever, fighting itself as much as any external foe. In the dark, men asked themselves the question none dared speak aloud. What if the greatest enemy of this crusade is not outside our walls, but within? Still, they marched. The dream of Jerusalem, or whatever prize lay at the heart of this forgotten campaign, pulled them forward. But the shadow of treachery hung over every step. Even victories could not drive it away, for the suspicion lingered that those victories were bought with betrayal, and that every triumph only hid the knife waiting to strike in the dark. The most bitter irony was this. Many of the betrayals, both real and imagined, would never be recorded. Chroniclers, bound by fear or loyalty, wrote around them, smoothing away the cracks to preserve the illusion of unity. What survives in official records is the surface, the march of armies and the clash of swords. But beneath that surface, invisible to the parchment, ran a darker story, a war within the war, a crusade rutted by distrust. This was the unspoken truth. Treachery had become the language of the crusade, shaping every decision, every alliance, every downfall. And once such shadows took root, no oath, no banner, no prayer could drive them out. They would remain, festering, until the crusade itself collapsed under their weight. The crusaders walked forward into the unknown, tormented not only by the enemies they could see, but by the traitors they imagined, or perhaps truly knew, stood among them. The question was no longer if betrayal would strike, but when. And when it came, it would not fall on the heads of leaders alone, but on the entire host, crushing them beneath the shadow they themselves had nurtured. The crusade, fractured and paranoid, at last stumbled upon what should have been its moment of triumph. Before them rose the walls of a fortified city, a jewel of stone and defiance perched upon the edge of the wilderness. From a distance, it seemed the prize that would redeem their misery, high towers glinting in the sun, storerooms surely filled with grain, wells deep with water, and a citadel that, if captured, would become a beacon of Christian victory. For the starving, half-broken host, it was a promise of salvation. Yet salvation proved a mirage. The commanders could not agree on how, or even whether, to strike. One faction argued for an immediate assault, convinced that the city's defenders were weak and unprepared. Another urged caution, whispering that the walls concealed hidden traps, or worse, that rival lords had already made secret pacts with the enemy. The council dissolved into shouting, each lord more determined to block his rivals and to defeat the city itself. What should have been a moment of unity became a theater of hesitation and pride. As the leaders quarreled, the soldiers waited. Days stretched into weeks, and the siege never began. Tents sprouted around the city like weeds, but the camp had no order, no discipline. Patrols were half-hearted, rations dwindled, and disease crept silently between the rows of canvas. From the walls above, the defenders looked down, bewildered at an army too disorganized to attack and too stubborn to leave. To them, the crusade must have seemed like a phantom army, present in body, absent in will. The crusaders tried to prepare siege engines, but materials were scarce, and the Lord hoarded resources for themselves. Half-built towers rotted in the mud. Catapults stood unmanned, their ropes unraveling, their arms never released. The men tasked with construction often deserted, muttering that no weapon could breach stone walls when their own leaders were weaker than the mortar that bound them. Even when ladders were raised, they were left to gather dust, for no commander dared order the first charge, fearing that rivals would withhold support and leave his men to slaughter. The longer they lingered, the worse their condition grew. Supplies dwindled until bread was nothing more than coarse crumbs mixed with weeds. Horses died, their carcasses butchered for desperate meals. Water turned foul, carrying sickness from tent to tent. The city's defenders, safe behind their walls, hurled insults as easily as arrows, mocking the crusaders as beggars in armor. Each day the crusade stayed idle was another day of humiliation, another nail in the coffin of their holy cause. And yet, beneath the surface, darker forces were at play. Whispers spread that some lords had already struck bargains with the city's leaders, promising to spare it in exchange for gold, food, or safe passage. Scouts who ventured too close to the walls vanished without trace, fueling suspicion that they had been captured and bribed into silence. One tale told of a knight who returned from parley wearing a cloak richer than any the crusaders could afford, a gift, some said, for betrayal. No one could prove these accusations, but the mere suspicion was enough to freeze any chance of unity. The city remained untouched, not because it was impregnable, but because the crusade had already collapsed from within. Soldiers began to laugh bitterly at the idea of a siege, calling it the siege that never was. They joked that their enemies did not need to fight them, for hunger and pride were sharper than any sword. To them, the walls of the city were less formidable than the walls of arrogance and distrust their own leaders had built. As weeks became months, the host began to scatter. Some lords pulled their banners away in secret, abandoning the camp under cover of night. Others lingered out of spite, determined to see their rivals fail, even if it meant their own men starved. Desertion bled the army daily, until the campfires grew fewer and fewer, their glow no longer enough to illuminate the vast fields around the city. What makes this moment most haunting is that it was almost erased from history. Chronicles mention a halt before a stronghold, but rarely admit that no true battle was fought. Instead, they disguise the paralysis as strategy, claiming that the Crusaders chose to move on for higher purposes. But behind those words lies the truth. They failed, not because of the enemy's strength, but because they no longer had the strength to act. The siege that never was became a symbol of the crusade itself, a promise unfulfilled, a vision squandered, a destiny broken by pride and fear. For the men who starved outside those walls, the memory of their inaction burned deeper than any wound. They had come across the world to fight for God, but when faced with stone and steel, their true enemies proved to be hesitation, betrayal, and the chains of their own division. When the crusade finally withdrew, it did so without battle drums or trumpets. There was no heroic retreat, no solemn procession. The army simply melted away, leaving the city standing untouched, its towers gleaming in quiet triumph. For the defenders, it was as if the invaders had been nothing more than a dream, a nightmare that came, lingered, and dissolved before dawn. But for the Crusaders, the shame of that moment never faded. They marched onward into the unknown, thinner, weaker, and more haunted than before. The siege that never was followed them like a ghost, a reminder that their crusade was already rotting from within. And though they still carried crosses on their chests, those crosses no longer marked warriors of faith, but wanderers lost in a war that seemed less holy with every passing day. The city they failed to take would outlast them, standing tall long after the crusade itself was forgotten. Yet the silence of its walls spoke louder than any battle cry. The greatest defeats are not those suffered against enemies, but those inflicted by the hands of one's own. The crusade moved on from the walls it never stormed, but it carried more than hunger and exhaustion. It carried broken promises like stones in its chest. Oaths had been sworn before altars, beneath banners, and in the presence of relics that contained the very bones of saints. Those vows were meant to bind the host together, to give divine weight to loyalty. Yet, in the shadow of defeat, those sacred words shattered one by one, until the air of the camp was thick with betrayal. It began with whispers of desertion. Knights who had once sworn before God to never abandon the cause now slipped away in the night, taking their men, their horses, and their provisions. When questioned, those who remained insisted that deserters had broken their most sacred oaths, but in private, many admitted they envied them. Hunger and despair had eroded the holiness of promises once thought unbreakable. Then came the breaking of alliances. Two lords who had clasped hands before priests, sealing their friendship in blood and prayer, suddenly turned on each other. One accused the other of withholding food, the other of plotting to usurp command. Their soldiers clashed in a brutal skirmish not against foreign enemies, but against supposed brothers in arms. The very oaths that had bound them had become weapons, twisted into accusations of dishonor. Priests tried to restore order, reminding the Crusaders that to break an oath sworn in God's name was to invite eternal damnation. But their warnings fell on ears deafened by desperation. When a man's stomach was empty and his feet bled from endless marches, eternity felt like a distant concern. Survival demanded pragmatism, and pragmatism demanded broken promises. The men no longer feared hellfire. They feared the gnawing hunger that greeted them each morning. One chronicler tells of a knight who stood before his men, lifted his cross from around his neck, and snapped it in two. "This vow has brought us nothing but ruin," he said, throwing the pieces into the mud. His followers, stunned, expected him to be struck down. But no lightning fell, no divine punishment descended. Instead, he walked away alive, and many of his men followed. To those left behind, the moment was more terrifying than any battle. If God no longer punished oath-breakers, what force remained to hold them together? The breaking of oaths did not stop at desertion or feuding. It seeped into every layer of the crusade. Some men who had sworn chastity with their vows took comfort in stolen embraces, caring little for their purity when death pressed so near. Others who had pledged charity stole openly from their comrades. Even lords who had promised justice allowed theft and violence to go unpunished, provided it benefited their faction. What had once been sacred was now merely words, hollow and fragile, discarded whenever convenient. And yet, the most dangerous broken oaths were not those between men and God, but those between the Crusaders themselves. Trust is a fragile thread, and once snapped, it cannot be mended. Soldiers no longer believed their commanders' promises of food or safety. Commanders no longer trusted their soldiers' loyalty. Agreements made one day were broken the next, until every negotiation became a gamble, every alliance a trap waiting to spring. It was as though the Crusade had entered a realm where words had lost their power. No vow was sacred, no promise binding, no oath unbreakable. Even the language of faith had become corrupted. Men still prayed, but their prayers sounded more like bargains. Deliver me food, and I will serve you still. Save my family, and I will keep your cross. Religion had become conditional, stripped of or enclosed in desperation. The irony is that oaths had once been the lifeblood of crusading. When the journey began, men took the cross as a holy vow, binding themselves not only to each other but to the divine. Their very identity as crusaders depended on this act. To break that oath was to forfeit honor, to become an exile among both men and angels. But now, exile seemed preferable to death, and honor was a luxury none could afford. For the defenders of the cities and villages they passed, this shift was a gift. They saw the crusade unravel not through sieges or battles, but through its own unfaithfulness. Every broken oath weakened the host more effectively than any war or sword could. Why resist a force that was destroying itself from within? And yet, for those within the crusade, the collapse of promises was more than a military failure. It was a spiritual crisis. Men had built their lives on the belief that vows bound them to something eternal. When those vows shattered, so too did the foundation of their faith. They began to wonder if even sacred oaths could be broken. What else was a lie? Did God truly walk with them, or had he turned his back long ago? The broken oaths marked a point of no return. After this, the crusade could not be restored to its former unity, no matter how many victories it might win. Once promises had become meaningless. No speech, no relic, no ritual could knit the host together again. What marched on was no longer a crusade bound by faith, but a collection of individuals, each clinging to survival, each prepared to betray the next if it meant one more day of life. The chronicles softened this truth, describing desertions as strategic withdrawals, quarrels as misunderstandings, and oath-breaking as rare exceptions. But the silence between the lines reveals more than the words themselves. For an oath, once broken, leaves not only a scar on the man who betrayed it but on all who witnessed it. And those scars spread, multiplying until the entire body of the crusade was covered in them. The crusaders still bore the cross on their cloaks, but the symbol no longer meant what it once had. It was not a mark of faith, but of hypocrisy, a reminder of promises they could not keep and a cause that no longer held them together. The holy war had become a war of fragments, where every oath broken was another step toward collapse. They marched onward, yes, but every step echoed with hollow vows, every banner fluttered above broken promises. And though their chronicles would try to bury the truth, the reality lingered. The crusade had betrayed itself long before it was betrayed by others. As the crusade dragged itself forward, hollowed by hunger and divided by betrayal, something even darker began to seep through the cracks. Whispers of the very soul of the army had been corrupted. What had once been a holy march in God's name now sounded, to many, like the mutterings of heretics. Faith, the foundation of their cause, began to fracture in ways more dangerous than hunger or steel. At first, it was small murmurs around campfires that God had abandoned them. Men asked, in voices low and trembling, why heaven had not rewarded their vows. If they were truly chosen, why did they starve? Why did they freeze? Why were their brothers struck down by pestilence while their enemies flourished? The question spread like embers caught on wind, and soon the fire of doubt burned in every corner of camp. Some priests tried to stamp it out, preaching that their suffering was a divine test, a refining fire to prove their devotion. But the words rang hollow to men who watched their children die in their arms, or who buried comrade by the dozen in frozen earth. The sermons that once inspired or now drew scorn. If this is God's test, some muttered, then perhaps we march not for him, but for fools. Others took the whispers further. In secret, soldiers experimented with charms and amulets taken from local people, wearing them as protection against disease or hunger. Crosses were hidden beneath talismans of bone or stone. Men who had once sworn to destroy heathen practices now clutched them in desperation, muttering foreign prayers in the hope that someone, anyone, might hear. To their commanders, these acts were treason against Christ. To the soldiers, There was simple survival. Rumors spread of darker practices. Tales spoke of men sacrificing animals at night. Their blood spilled not in the name of the cross, but in the name of forgotten gods of the land. Others whispered that some had even turned to human sacrifice, though such stories may have been born from fear rather than fact. Whether true or false, the whispers poisoned the host further, convincing many that their comrades were no longer Christians at all, but blasphemers cloaked in armor. The leaders seized upon the word heresy as both weapon and shield. Accusations flew like arrows. A lord whose rival gained influence would brand him a heretic, claiming his failures were proof of God's judgment. Soldiers who deserted were denounced not only as cowards, but as apostates who had abandoned the faith. The label a heretic became more than a condemnation. It became a political tool, a way to isolate and destroy enemies within the crusade without ever drawing the sword. But the accusations had a cost. Every time one man was branded a heretic, more soldiers lost faith in the unity of their cause. They began to believe the crusade was cursed, led not by holy men but by wolves in priestly robes. Some even claimed that the entire crusade was itself heresy, that the true will of God had never been to march, and that they had all been deceived by prideful leaders into sin. This was the deepest cut of all, the fear that their suffering was not a holy trial, but punishment for marching under a false banner. The chronicles, fearful of scandal, mention almost nothing of these whispers. Yet in the margins of one account survives a haunting note. They doubted the truth, and in their doubt they lost themselves. It is only a fragment, but enough to suggest that heresy was not a rumor from enemies, but a disease that gnawed at the very marrow of the host. For the ordinary crusader, the whispers of heresy made the air heavy with dread. If their brothers were not true Christians, then who could be trusted? If their priests preached lies, then where was salvation to be found? And if the crusade itself was a sin, then every step forward only dragged them deeper into damnation. Faith, once their shield, had become a blade turned against them. Some tried to cling desperately to belief. They carried relics closer than before, kissing them in trembling devotion. They fasted and prayed even as their bodies wasted, hoping to prove themselves loyal amid betrayal. Yet their piety only deepened the divide, for others mocked them as fools clinging to an empty sky. What had once united the Crusaders now split them apart. Two camps, one still clutching faith, the other convinced that faith had already failed. The whispers of heresy mark a transformation. This was no longer a crusade of Christians marching against unbelievers. It was a crusade of Christians doubting one another, seeing in their comrades the very heathens they had sworn to destroy. Every prayer became suspect, every ritual tainted, every oath questioned. They had crossed seas to face foreign foes, but found the enemy within their own souls. The silence of official history hides this most dangerous truth, that the forgotten crusade may have died not from swords or starvation, but from the collapse of belief itself. For when faith is gone, no army, however mighty, can stand. The crusaders marched onward, but their steps no longer rang with holy conviction. They trudged through mud and snow like shadows of the men they once were, burdened by the fear that God was no longer with them, or worse, that he never had been. And with every mile, the whispers of heresy grew louder, until even the most devout could not silence the question echoing in their hearts. What if we had been abandoned? As famine deepened and faith splintered, the Crusaders reached a point where survival itself became the only creed that mattered. Once, they had sworn oaths to God, king, and country. Now, those vows felt distant, fragile things compared to the immediate hunger gnawing at their bellies or the bitter cold clawing at their skin. To live through another day became the only vow most men could keep. At first, survival meant bending rules, stealing bread from supply wagons, hoarding dried meat instead of sharing, or slipping away from the march to hunt in secret. These acts, though condemned, were small rebellions, sins justified by desperation. But as the hardships worsened, survival demanded more brutal sacrifices. The weakest were the first to pay the price. Old men who could no longer carry arms, children who slowed the march, and wounded comrades who begged for help were quietly abandoned on the roadside. Some were left with prayers, others with nothing at all. In the beginning, men looked back in guilt when they abandoned their fellows. Later, they stopped looking back entirely. Mercy became a burden they could no longer afford. Food itself became a currency sharper than any sword. Men traded loyalty for scraps, swore oaths for a crust of bread, and betrayed their comrades for a handful of grain. Whole companies broke apart over supplies, turning on one another in sudden bursts of violence. A man's worth was no longer measured by his courage, but by how much food he carried. Even leaders struggled to keep control, for their soldiers saw them less as commanders of faith and more as hoarders of treasure, the treasure being bread, meat, or wine. The chronicles that survive speak in veiled language of unholy meals consumed during this march. The exact nature of these meals is unclear, but whispers suggest the darkest of truths, that in their hunger, some men turn to cannibalism. There are tales of bodies being stripped not for burial, but for sustenance. Official accounts pass quickly over such rumors, but they cannot fully erase them. Whether true or born of fear, the belief that comrades had resorted to such acts spread terror through the host. Men began to fear not only starvation, but the possibility that they themselves might be the next meal should they fall behind. Even when cannibalism is not spoken of, the chronicles admit that the Crusaders raided villages indiscriminately, slaughtering peasants for whatever grain or livestock they could seize. It no longer mattered if the villagers were Christians or pagans. Survival erased the boundaries of faith. To kill a fellow Christian for bread was as common as killing an enemy. The crusade that had begun with banners of holy war now resembled a band of marauders, leaving behind a trail of ash and blood. Yet not all chose savagery. Some, even at their weakest, clung to ideals of brotherhood and sacrifice. There are rare accounts of men giving away their last rations to comrades, or priests who starved so that children might live. These small acts of kindness glowed faintly in the surrounding darkness, though often they ended in the death of the giver. For every tale of cruelty, there existed its opposite, proof that even at the edge of despair, humanity was not entirely lost. Leadership fractured under the weight of survival. Lords who once commanded obedience now faced rebellion from starving men who saw them as hoarders of food. Some were deposed, others slain outright, their supplies divided among their killers. Priests lost authority as their sermons clashed with the stomachs of the starving. Even relics, once carried with reverence, were traded away for food. What had been sacred was now reduced to mere barter, a sign of just how far they had fallen. The true price of survival was not merely physical but spiritual. Every compromise, every theft, every betrayal, every abandoned comrade left scars upon the Crusaders' souls. Men who had set out with a dream of eternal salvation now wondered if they had already damned themselves by the choices they made. Their survival was bought with sin, and with each sin they carried the weight of a growing despair. But in the moment, few had the strength to care. To survive meant to silence the conscience, to harden the heart. They told themselves that God would forgive them, that necessity excused their deeds, that salvation could still be won once the suffering ended. Whether these were truths or lies, the men could not say. What mattered was that they lived another day, even if living meant sacrificing everything else. The chronicles, fearful of scandal, record this chapter only in fragments. But from those fragments, we see the shadow of a host transformed. This was no longer an army of holy warriors marching to victory. It was a starving mob clawing for existence, bound not by faith but by desperation, ready to do anything to see another dawn. The price of survival was steep. It demanded not just the abandonment of comrades, but the abandonment of vows, of honor, of faith itself. For some, it demanded the abandonment of humanity altogether. And though many survived those dark days, what they carried in their hearts was not triumph but guilt, a knowledge that their survival had cost more than they could ever repay. Thus, when we speak of the forgotten crusade, we must remember this. It was not only an army that perished, but also a dream. For in the pursuit of survival, the holy cause for which they had set out was lost, buried beneath hunger, blood, and shame. If famine and despair weakened the Crusaders from the outside, betrayal corroded them from within. It was not the arrows of the enemy that cut deepest, but the treachery of those they had once called brothers in arms. Among the chronicles, scattered fragments reveal a darker truth. The crusade was not undone by foreign sword alone, but by the poison of distrust and betrayal that seeped through its ranks. At first, betrayal took subtle forms: desertion, whispered plots, men quietly slipping away in the night. Some deserted to return home, others to sell their swords to local lords who offered food and coin. But others betrayed the cause outright, joining enemy ranks in exchange for safety. Tales exist of scouts who deliberately led their comrades into ambushes, lured by promises of survival or silver. In those moments, The line between friend and foe blurred, until no man could be sure who stood beside him in loyalty and who in treachery. Leadership was especially vulnerable. Hungry soldiers, disillusioned by broken promises, turned against their commanders. Some lords were accused of hoarding supplies, of feeding their households while the common soldiers starved. In more than one account, men stormed their leaders' tents, demanding food or vengeance. Entire companies fractured in mutiny, replacing knights with charismatic but ruthless men who promised full bellies rather than spiritual glory. The Crusade, once bound by hierarchy and faith, splintered into rival factions clawing for survival. Yet betrayal was not confined to starving soldiers. At the highest levels, rivalries and envy drove leaders to sabotage one another. Chronicles suggest that some nobles deliberately withheld reinforcement from allies during battle, ensuring their downfall. Others spread false rumors to weaken rivals' reputations. In the chaos of hunger and despair, ambition sharpened into treachery. What had begun as a united holy endeavor now resembled a theater of scheming lords, each guarding his power even as the crusade itself collapsed. And then came the ultimate betrayal, alliances struck with the very enemies they had sworn to fight. Desperate for supplies, some crusader leaders bartered with local Muslim or pagan chieftains, offering stolen relics, promises of peace, or even military support against rival Christians. The cause for which thousands had shed blood was thus traded for survival, its ideals betrayed at the negotiation table. The irony was cruel. Those who had crossed oceans to wage war in God's name sometimes turned their swords against fellow crusaders while shaking hands with those once branded as infidels. The most haunting betrayals, however, were not political but personal. Hunger made enemies of friends, and suspicion turned brothers into executioners. There are accounts of men murdering their own comrades to steal food, of squires poisoning their knights, of brothers abandoning one another in the wilderness. Bonds of loyalty forged over years shattered in an instant when survival was at stake. It was said that a man feared not only the enemy beyond the campfires, but the knife of the companion who sat beside him. Such treachery left scars deeper than wounds. The survivors wrote of an atmosphere thick with paranoia, when no one trusted another. Men shared meals with comrades while secretly wondering if those same comrades plotted their death. Confession and prayer could no longer cleanse the air of suspicion. Once, the Crusaders had prayed for victory. Now, they prayed simply that the man beside them would not turn traitor before dawn. The betrayal within the ranks was perhaps the final breaking point of the Crusade spirit. Armies can endure hunger, even defeat, so long as unity holds. But when brother turns on brother, the cause is lost. The men who still clung to faith, who still believed in the sanctity of their mission, watched in despair as treachery spread like rot. To them, it seemed not only that their army had failed, but that God himself had withdrawn his hand, allowing the devil of mistrust to consume them from within. Later chroniclers, uneasy with such revelations, softened their accounts. They spoke instead of disunity or discord, words that hinted at conflict without admitting the depth of betrayal. But the silences between their lines speak volumes. If betrayal had not been widespread, why would they avoid naming it? Why would they turn so carefully away from the subject? The truth lingers in those gaps, that a forgotten crusade collapsed as much from inner treachery as from outer attack. For those who lived through it, the memory of betrayal was often more bitter than hunger or wounds. To be defeated by an enemy could be borne with dignity, even framed as martyrdom. But to be betrayed by a friend was to carry a wound that never healed. Many who returned home from a crusade carried this bitterness in silence, ashamed to admit how their brothers had turned against them. Some chroniclers suggest that this silence, the refusal to speak openly of what truly happened, was one reason the crusade was quietly buried in history. It was not simply failure, it was shame too deep to record. And so the story of betrayal within becomes a mirror for all great causes. Noble beginnings can be corroded not just by external foes, but by the weaknesses within the human heart, envy, fear, greed, and the temptation to survive at any cost. The forgotten crusade reveals this harsh truth, that the most dangerous enemy is sometimes not across the battlefield, but seated beside you in the ranks. As the crusaders stumbled onward, weakened by treachery as much as starvation, their numbers dwindled. Faith, honor, and unity had been traded away piece by piece, until only fragments remained. Yet their journey was not over. Beyond betrayal awaited something even more devastating, the collapse not only of their army, but of the very meaning of their crusade. For after betrayal came disillusionment, and with it, the slow death of the holy dream itself. The crusade had begun with faith as its armor, its guiding star, and its very reason for being. Men had left their homes, their families, and their safety because they believed God himself had called them. But by the time the Crusaders staggered onward, broken and betrayed, faith was no longer a shield. It had become a question, a haunting uncertainty that gnawed at their souls as surely as hunger gnawed at their bodies. At first, faith faltered quietly. Soldiers still prayed before battle, but their voices lacked conviction. Priests still lifted relics high, but their sermons were met with blank stares instead of fervent cries. Men crossed themselves not from devotion, but from habit. Each whispered prayer carried an unspoken question: why has God abandoned us? Hunger and betrayal had eroded belief, but what truly shattered it were the unfulfilled promises. The Crusaders had been told that God's favor would guide them, that their enemies would fall before them, and that their cause was righteous. Instead, famine stalked them, comrades turned traitor, and their victories dissolved into ash. Some began to murmur that perhaps this crusade had never been blessed at all, that it was not God's war, but man's folly dressed in holy words. The clergy struggled to hold the line. Priests preached that suffering was a test, that each hardship brought them closer to heaven, that martyrdom awaited the faithful. But these words rang hollow when children starved and corpses lined the roads. What kind of God tests his people by feeding them to wolves? One soldier is said to have spat before abandoning his cross and walking away. For many, the crucifix that once symbolized salvation became instead a bitter reminder of betrayal. Some hurled their crosses into the fire in defiance. Others sold relics for food. The sacred was profaned, not out of malice, but out of despair. If God would not feed them, then what use was a symbol? In the flicker of burning wood and broken faith, the holy war began to look less like divine destiny and more like a cruel deception. There were still a few who clung fiercely to belief, and they became almost fanatical in their devotion. These men insisted that every disaster proved the end times were near, that their suffering was written in prophecy. They lashed themselves in penance, cried out for forgiveness, and urged others to do the same. But instead of inspiring, their zeal only deepened the division. For the weary, such voices sounded less like prophets and more like madmen screaming into the night. The collapse of faith was not only spiritual but also practical. Discipline in the army depended on shared belief, obedience rooted in the conviction that they were fighting for God's will. When that belief crumbled, so too did order. Soldiers ignored priests, mocked sermons, and disobeyed commands that no longer seemed sanctified. Without faith binding them, the Crusaders were no longer an army. They were merely a mob staggering forward, bound together by habit more than purpose. Perhaps the most haunting sign of this collapse lies in the chronicles themselves. In earlier campaigns, chroniclers wrote with reverence, framing every event as part of God's grand design. But in the accounts of this forgotten crusade, their words grow hesitant, fragmented, almost ashamed. They avoid grand claims of divine providence, writing instead of famine, betrayal, and despair. The silence where triumph should have been recorded is itself a testimony that faith had collapsed not only among the soldiers, but among those tasked with preserving their memory. For the survivors, the collapse of faith left a scar deeper than wounds. To lose a battle was one thing. To lose belief was another. Some returned home not as heroes of Christendom, but as broken men who could no longer pray. They carried the weight of unanswered prayers, of promises that turned to lies, of a God who seemed silent when they needed him most. This silence haunted them, and many never spoke of the crusade again. And yet, in this collapse there was also revelation. For a few, the breaking of faith did not end in despair, but in clarity. They saw through the illusions of glory and holy war, recognizing instead the greed, ambition, and human folly that had driven them. These men became cynics, skeptics, sometimes even reformers. They whispered that the crusade was not erased because it failed militarily, but because it threatened the very foundations of belief. A holy war that ended in the collapse of faith was too dangerous a memory to preserve. The crusade had begun with the ringing of church bells and the promise of heaven. It ended with silence, the silence of men who no longer believed, the silence of chronicles that dared not speak, the silence of God who seemed absent. In that silence, the crusade dissolved, not with a final glorious battle, but with a slow extinguishing of faith itself. And yet, One question lingers in the shadows of the silence. Was the collapse of faith a failure? Or was it, in its own way, a hidden victory? For by stripping away illusions, by forcing men to see the truth of human ambition behind the veil of holiness, perhaps the forgotten crusade revealed more about the nature of power, religion, and survival than any triumphant victory could. But whatever the lesson, for those who endured it, the collapse of faith was a final blow. Their bodies might continue the march, but their spirits had already fallen. The crusade was dead in all but name, its soul extinguished long before its remnants reached the end. Would you like me to continue expanding the next section in the same cinematic style, carrying this emotional descent toward the final revelation and reflection? When the crusade finally stumbled to its end, there was no triumphant procession, no victory banners, no hymns of thanksgiving echoing through cathedrals. Instead, there was silence. The kind of silence history reserves for things too shameful, too painful, or too dangerous to remember. Unlike the celebrated conquest of Jerusalem or the grand tales of kings and saints, this crusade was quietly set aside, its story scattered in fragments, whispered in shame, or deliberately erased. The survivors returned home not as heroes, but as shadows of themselves. They carried wounds that would never heal, hunger scars, betrayal etched into memory, the gnawing emptiness of faith abandoned. Some refused to speak of their ordeal, even when asked. Others lied, reshaping their memories into half-truths, framing their failure as bad fortune rather than admitting to the horrors they had witnessed or committed. A crusader could confess sin, but how could he confess to eating the flesh of a comrade, or to killing a brother for bread? Silence became their only absolution. The Church, too, had reasons for silence. This crusade had been launched with the same divine authority as others, promised the same blessings, cloaked in the same holy rhetoric. To admit its collapse, its betrayals, its loss of faith, would be to admit that God's favor was not guaranteed, that holy war could end not in glory but in ruin. So the chronicles were carefully edited, the shameful episodes omitted or softened. Where there should have been a saga of triumph, there was instead a gap. The crusade was remembered officially only in vague terms, its details swallowed by deliberate forgetfulness. But silence is itself a story. The very absence of records tells us that something happened too scandalous to preserve. Why does one crusade shine in stained glass and song, while another vanishes into the shadows of forgotten parchment? The answer lies not in victory or defeat alone, but in the corrosive truths this crusade exposed. It revealed that men could turn to savagery under God's banner, that betrayal could be more deadly than the enemy, and that faith itself could wither in the wilderness. Such truths threatened the entire narrative of Christendom's holy wars, and so the easiest answer was silence. For those who tried to speak, their words were often dismissed. Chroniclers who hinted at cannibalism or treachery framed them as isolated rumors, not the dark heartbeat of the entire campaign. Local accounts that described villages burned by crusaders were overshadowed by grander stories of piety and valor elsewhere. The few voices that dared to preserve the memory of this crusade were drowned beneath centuries of official histories that celebrated victories and saints while quietly burying failures. And yet, silence cannot bury everything. In the scattered whispers of old texts, in the contradictions of chronicles, in the faint outlines of erased stories, the truth still lingers. The forgotten crusade leave behind not clarity, but shadows, and in those shadows we glimpse something raw, something unsettling. Perhaps this is why the story still matters, because it was silenced not for lack of importance, but because its lessons were too dangerous to proclaim. For the survivors, silence was not only imposed but chosen. Many returned to their villages, blending back into the rhythm of plowing fields and tending hearths. Outwardly, they lived as if nothing had happened. Inwardly, they carried memories that haunted them to their graves. Imagine a man kneeling in church, hearing the priest speak of God's favor, while remembering the night he abandoned a dying comrade in the snow. Imagine a woman welcoming home her husband, only to sense the hollowness in his eyes, the silence that wrapped around him whenever she asked of his journey. The crusade lived on, not in chronicles, but in the unspoken shadows of human hearts. Silence is not peace. Silence is weight. Over time, the burden of this forgotten crusade became a scar on Christendom itself, a reminder that beneath the banners and hymns, human weakness had corroded even the holiest of missions. And in this way, perhaps, the silence tells us more than words ever could. The Church could erase parchments, but it could not erase a lesson. That men are fragile, faith is fragile, and that glory can dissolve into shame. Why does this matter now, centuries later? Because silence shapes history as much as speech. What we remember defines us, but so does what we choose to forget. To uncover the forgotten crusade is to confront not just an episode of the past, but the machinery of history itself, the way memory is curated, reshaped, or erased to protect power. In the absence of official stories, the fragments that remain become louder, daring us to ask, what else has been silenced? What truths still lie buried in the shadows? The forgotten crusade ends not with a battle, but with this silence. And in that silence lies both tragedy and revelation. Tragedy, because the men who suffered were denied even the dignity of remembrance. Revelation, because the very act of forgetting reveals what those in power feared to admit. That holy war is not immune to corruption. That faith can falter. That humanity, when pushed to the edge, reveals its darkest face. And so, the forgotten crusade becomes more than just a lost chapter. It becomes a mirror, showing us the cost of silence, the fragility of belief, and the truths history would rather we never see. Would you like me to now expand the final section, 23, as the emotional and philosophical climax, bringing the audience to that powerful call to reflection you asked for, leaving them shaken but deeply thoughtful? The crusade that history chose to forget did not end with a clash of armies or the ringing of victory bells. It ended with silence, with scattered survivors limping home, and with a deliberate erasure of their story from the chronicles of glory. Yet, even when parchment was scrubbed clean and priests refused to speak of it, the crusade did not vanish entirely. Its echoes ripple still, carried in whispers, in contradictions, and in the uneasy questions it forces us to ask about the nature of war, faith, and memory. Imagine, for a moment, the survivors returning to their villages. They had left as holy warriors, draped in symbols of Christ, marching under banners of destiny. They returned gaunt, haunted, often silent. Families greeted them with joy, but behind the joy lurked questions that could not be asked. Why do you never speak of what happened? Why do your eyes look so far away? Why does your voice falter when the priest speaks of glory? These men carried their silence like an invisible wound. Some buried it with prayer, others with ale, some with years of wordless labor. But the memories did not fade. They lived on, unspoken, in the cracks of Christ's story. The echoes reached further still, into the holes of power. The church that had proclaimed the crusade in God's name chose to bury it in shadow. Official histories moved swiftly to celebrate other campaigns, other victories, replacing shame with triumph. To admit the truth, that one crusade collapsed into hunger, betrayal, and the death of faith itself, was too dangerous. It would shake the faithful, weaken the colder arms, unravel the myth that God's favor always crowned those who fought in his name. So silence became strategy. To forget was not neglect, but intent. But history is never truly silent. The very act of forgetting leaves behind traces, gaps in chronicles, erased names, abrupt endings to what should have been grand tales. These absences speak. They ask us to lean closer, to search the margin for what was cut away. And in doing so, they reveal truths perhaps sharper than those preserved openly. The forgotten crusade reminds us that history is not only what is remembered, it is also what is hidden, reshaped, or deliberately destroyed. What, then, are we left with? Not a clear account of battles and victories, but a haunting lesson about human nature. This crusade stripped away the veneer of holy war and exposed what lies beneath: hunger, fear, ambition, betrayal, desperation. It showed us that men, even when clothed in faith, remain human, fragile, flawed, sometimes noble, sometimes monstrous. It showed us that when pressed to the edge, survival can eclipse every oath, every vow, every dream of glory. And yet, within that darkness, there were sparks. The chronicles in its small act of mercy, men who gave their last crust of bread, priests who starved so that children might eat, comrades who carried the wounded until they themselves collapsed. These fragile acts of humanity gleam brighter precisely because they flicker against the surrounding shadows. They remind us that even when faith collapses and armies turn savage, the human spirit can still choose compassion. It may not save the crusade, but it redeems something deeper. The forgotten crusade also leaves us with a question of perspective. Was its silence truly a loss, or was it, in its way, a revelation? Victories teach us little beyond triumph, but failure, especially failure so absolute, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Perhaps that is why the Crusade was buried, because it revealed too much. It showed that divine favor is not guaranteed, that faith can break, that holy war can corrode into atrocity. These are lessons dangerous to power, but vital to humanity. As we listen to its echoes now, centuries later, the Crusade becomes more than forgotten war. It becomes a mirror. It asks us, what do we choose to remember? What do we choose to erase? And what truths lie hidden in the silence of our own histories? Every society tells stories of glory, of heroes, of righteous causes. But beneath those stories, in the silences and omissions, lie the darker truths that power would rather conceal. The forgotten Crusade dares us to look into that silence, not just in the Middle Ages, but in our own time. For even today, wars are wrapped in rhetoric, failures buried in shadows, betrayals silenced in the name of unity. To remember the forgotten Crusade is to resist that silence, to demand that history include not only the victories but the scars. And so, the echoes of this war call to us still. They whisper that memory is fragile, that truth is vulnerable, that silence is a weapon as sharp as any sword. They remind us that faith can inspire greatness, but it can also mask greed and ambition. They warn us that unity can fracture, that survival can demand terrible prices, that even the holiest causes can be corrupted by human weakness. But they also leave us with a final, haunting reflection. If a crusade could be buried in silence, if thousands of lives could be erased from memory because their story was inconvenient, then what else lies forgotten? What other truths sleep in the shadows of history, waiting to be uncovered? The forgotten crusade is gone, its banners rotted, its chronicles thinned to whispers. Yet in that silence, we find its greatest legacy, not triumph, not glory, but a question that lingers like an echo. What if the past would know is only half the story? And what would it mean if the truth we have buried changes how we see everything? The final echo is this: the war may have been forgotten, but its silence speaks. And it speaks not only of the past, but of us,